Welcome to Victorian Britain, the era where society invented table manners, afternoon tea, and a fear of absolutely everything. If you ever wondered why Victorians carried weapons disguised as umbrellas, fans, hats, and occasionally vegetables, we'll get there eventually. You must first understand the environment that produced this level, but the panic. Picture it. The year is somewhere between 1840 and 1890, and London has fully committed to being both magnificent and terrifying at the same time. It's a place where the population explodes faster than anyone can invent indoor plumbing, where the streets are lit just enough to make shadows look extra suspicious, and where industrial smog blends with natural fog to create a nightmarish soup that could hide a person, a horse, and an entire orchestra without effort. Imagine leaving your house in the morning and 3 steps later, losing sight of your own moral compass. That's Victorian visibility. The city's population boomed from about 1 million to over 6 million in just a few decades, which sounds exciting until you remember that city planning, policing, sanitation, and basic human boundaries were not prepared for this. Crime thrived in the overcrowded slums, from petty theft to organised gangs who specialised in removing your wallet, your watch, and probably your self-respect. In neighbourhoods like Whitechapel, police patrols were so ineffective that the fog itself was considered more reliable. And then there were the roughs, young men who roamed the streets looking for trouble, entertainment, or a combination of both. They might shove you, mock you, trip you, steal your belongings, or simply frighten you into offering up your valuables voluntarily. These individuals existed in an era before video games, so naturally, street harassment counted as a recreational hobby. Middle-class Victorians found this terrifying, especially if they had never seen a brawl outside of Shakespeare. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Pickpockets were the Olympic athletes of Victorian crime. They trained, they practiced, and they took their craft seriously. Some operated in teams, others solo, but all shared one goal: making your pockets emptier than your savings account after Christmas. Tourists arriving in London were warned about them constantly, because nothing says welcome like a pamphlet titled "Things that will probably be stolen from you immediately." Of course, sensational newspapers did not help. Victorian journalism specialised in reporting crimes with the subtlety of a theatrical scream. If a horse kicked someone, the headline likely read, "Undead demon horse and innocent man." Articles described back alley robberies with the kind of poetic horror usually reserved for Gothic novels. Penny dreadfuls, cheap, mass-produced crime stories, convinced readers that London was essentially a haunted maze populated entirely by knife-wielding villains. Every dark alley wasn't just possibly unsafe. It was definitely where someone met an untimely end last Tuesday. Women, especially those travelling alone, faced additional dangers. Without modern lighting or populated late-night streets, they navigated a world where unwelcome attention was constant and public harassment went mostly unchecked. This created a demand for subtle, socially acceptable defensive tools, because you couldn't exactly pull out a medieval longsword while wearing a corseted gown. Well, you could, but you wouldn't breathe again until Thursday. But it wasn't just people Victorians feared. It was the city itself. The fog was legendary. Thick, yellow-green, oily, and absolutely determined to ruin your sense of direction. You could step outside and instantly become a missing person. Criminals used this murk to their advantage, slipping away like Victorian ninjas who hadn't yet discovered soap. The fog was so dense at times that cab drivers had to walk in front of their own horses just to avoid hitting something, such as a lamppost or their own existential dread. Now add the soundscape: rattling carriage wheels, clattering hooves, street vendors shouting, newspapers, boys yelling, "Murder! Read all about it!" Even when the article was about a bakery opening. Every noise seemed to imply danger. Every shadow hinted at a lurking figure. Every sudden movement felt like the prelude to theft, assault, or, worst of all, accidental small talk with a stranger. And then there was the police force. The Metropolitan Police were still evolving, still building systems, and still learning that criminals did not vanish simply because you shook your fist at them. Officers worked without modern communication tools, often patrolling alone, reacting slowly, and arriving just in time to say, "Looks like something happened here." With limited manpower and massive neighbourhoods to cover, Londoners quickly realised they were responsible for protecting themselves. All of this created the perfect environment for the self-defence gadget industry to flourish. A world where fear was constant, crime was unpredictable, and you couldn't rely on the police to rescue you. But you could rely on your umbrella to stab someone if necessary. It was a time when creativity met panic, and panic won. By the time Victorians began purchasing umbrella swords, hatpins long enough to skewer a ham, and muffs hiding revolvers, it felt perfectly reasonable. After all, in a city where even the fog seemed hostile, personal defence wasn't just an option, it was survival with style. And so begins our journey into the world of Victorian self-defence, a landscape of ingenuity fueled by fear, accessories with alarming secret functions, and a society determined to protect itself from everything, including its own imagination. If the Victorians had one unstoppable force in their society, besides steam engines, judgment, and excessive lace, it was fear-based marketing. And nowhere did that thrive more than in the glorious, chaotic ecosystem of newspapers, penny dreadfuls, and serialised crime stories. If modern social media thrives on outrage, Victorian media perfected it first. They invented the art of selling panic one printed sheet at a time, and the public eagerly bought every issue. Welcome to the Victorian panic industry, where fear wasn't just an emotion, it was a business model. To understand how deeply this industry shaped the self-defence craze, imagine a world where every morning you open your newspaper and read that 5 burglars, 3 throat slashers, 2 jewel thieves, and 1 particularly rude pickpocket have been roaming your area. Now imagine the reporters wrote these stories as if auditioning for a gothic melodrama. That was Victorian crime journalism. Never calming, always exaggerated, occasionally fact-checked, and reliably terrifying. Victorian newspapers were in a competitive frenzy. Dozens of London papers battled daily for sales, and nothing sold faster than crime, especially crime written with dramatic flair. Headlines weren't just warnings, they were theatrical performances. A relatively simple mugging could be described as a savage assault in the deadly mist, as though the attacker was part man, part fog, part misunderstood poet. Newspapers understood something essential. Panic moves papers. Enter the penny dreadfuls. Cheap serial booklets costing 1 penny, containing stories so sensational they made Shakespeare look minimalist. These weekly installments, aimed primarily at young men and working-class readers, showcased villainous masterminds, shadowy alley lurkers, and supernatural criminals with suspiciously good dental hygiene. Characters like Spring-Heeled Jack, the legendary leaping menace of London, became public obsessions. People debated whether he was a demon, a criminal, or simply someone with astonishing calf muscles. But penny dreadfuls didn't just entertain. They blurred the line between fiction and reality. Many Victorians couldn't tell which stories were made up and which were merely dramatised versions of actual crimes. The result? A population convinced that danger lurked behind every lamp-post, door, curtain, and slightly enthusiastic houseplant. And then came serialised crime novels in mainstream publications, turning public paranoia into fashionable reading. Authors like Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens, never ones to waste a good opportunity for suspense, filled their chapters with mysterious strangers, threatening figures, and suspicious urban settings. Readers devoured these tales, eagerly awaiting the next instalment. Cliffhangers were weaponized. Every time a chapter ended with someone screaming, fainting, or discovering a clue, people raced to buy the next issue. None of these storytellers intended to spark a national obsession with personal defense gadgets, but the timing couldn't have been better. As the public consumed endless narratives of danger, the message became clear. You too could be the next victim unless you arm yourself creatively. Capitalists noticed. Soon advertisements appeared beside the very articles describing terrifying crimes, promoting gadgets with phrases like, "For those desiring peace of mind in these troubled times," or "Protect yourself where law enforcement may not reach." The same paper that warned you about a street gang would cheerfully sell you a spiked cane the following page. It was the Victorian equivalent of "click here to buy the problem-solving device you didn't know you needed until 5 seconds ago." Manufacturers realized they had struck gold. People didn't just want protection, they wanted protection disguised as acceptable Victorian accessories. Since carrying obvious weapons was frowned upon, nothing ruins a tea party like visible aggression. Creators designed tools that blended seamlessly into daily life. This led to an explosion of what we might generously call innovation, and more realistically call panic-driven creativity with questionable practicality. Companies produced self-defense umbrellas, muff pistols, attack-resistant jewelry, protective canes, and alarm devices loud enough to frighten the pigeons into retirement. Every year brought a new gadget marketed with phrases like, "recently tested in the most dangerous districts." Translation: someone waved it once in a dark alley, and we're counting that as scientific proof. One famous advertisement from the 1880s promised a device that could discourage ruffians without damaging one's gloves. Victorians wanted safety, yes, but not at the expense of fashion. Bookstores also stocked instructive manuals on city dangers. Some publications advised readers how to spot criminals based on posture, moustache angle, or suspiciously poetic language. Others suggested travellers carry a personal pocket alarm to arouse nearby citizens. Never mind that nearby citizens were also terrified and likely to run the opposite direction. As readers consumed more sensational crime stories, demand grew for devices that allowed them to play hero in their own narratives. The panic industry didn't merely profit from fear, it fed and shaped that fear. Crime might rise or fall, but public anxiety only needed to rise, and the gadget sales followed. It didn't help that the Victorians adored gadgets in general. This was the age of invention. People built mechanical birds, self-rocking cradles, automated door knockers, and machines that claimed to cure every illness known to mankind except the habit of inventing pointless machines. So when manufacturers offered tools that promised to keep you alive with a simple squeeze, click, or button press, people bought them enthusiastically. The Victorian panic industry is what happens when sensational journalism meets industrial creativity, and both decide to become business partners. Newspapers created the fear. Penny dreadfuls intensified the fear. Serial novels normalized the fear. Gadget makers monetized the fear. And consumers fueled it all because nothing terrifies a Victorians more than being unprepared, or unfashionably unprepared. Thus the groundwork was laid for the peculiar self-defense tools to come. Umbrellas that stabbed, hats that pierced, canes that did everything except walk for you, and perfume bottles with more bite than scent. A world ready to arm itself with sophistication, creativity, and a little bit of delusion. Victorians loved two things: staying dry and staying alive. And in an era where the weather was unpredictable and the streets were even more unpredictable, the umbrella quickly evolved from a humble rain shield into a socially acceptable self-defense tool that blended elegance with mild violence. The good news, it blocks the rain. The bad news, it also makes you look like you're 2 insults away from a duel. To understand why the umbrella became the Swiss Army knife of Victorian defence, you need to remember one crucial cultural truth. A gentleman was expected to be dignified at all times. You could not, under any circumstances, run, panic, shout, or wield anything overtly aggressive without risking your reputation. A sword on your hip? Far too dramatic. A pistol? Positively scandalous. But a nice umbrella? Utterly respectable. And that's precisely why weaponizing it became such an art. Enter the umbrella sword, the showstopper of discreet Victorian armaments. At first glance, it looked like any ordinary parasol or umbrella, complete with a polished handle and sturdy ribs, but inside the canopy's shaft hid a concealed blade long enough to turn polite conversation into a police report. The mechanism was simple, a twist or a click, and suddenly your mild-mannered weather shield became a dueling weapon worthy of an opera scene. Manufacturers marketed these umbrella swords with a certain restrained heroism, ideal for travellers, suitable for dark alleys, and perfectly inconspicuous. They knew their audience. Victorian gentlemen could now leave their homes brimming with confidence, knowing that if someone attempted to rob them, they could retaliate without dropping their sense of propriety or their umbrella. For those who found the idea of a full sword a bit too dramatic for daily errands, there were subtler options. Some umbrellas contained hidden spikes within the ferrule, the metal tip at the bottom. These spikes could be extended with a press of a button or a twist of the handle, instantly turning the umbrella into something resembling a defensive spear. Imagine politely tapping your umbrella on the pavement and accidentally revealing that you are, in fact, armed like a cautious gladiator. Another popular design involved weighted tips. Instead of deploying a blade, the umbrella simply had extra weight added to the end, just enough to make swinging it surprisingly effective. It allowed the user to defend themselves with the grace of a fencer and the subtlety of someone who's really hoping nobody notices how hard they're swinging. A well-timed strike could stun or deter an attacker, all while maintaining the outward appearance of someone simply trying to adjust their umbrella's stubborn frame. But let us not forget the most refined version, the combination umbrella. These devices contained multiple hidden features, a blade inside the shaft, a weighted tip, and sometimes even compartments for pepper dust or tiny alarms. The umbrella became less of a weather tool and more of a Victorian multi-weapon system, equal parts elegance and chaos. The impeccable craftsmanship of these umbrellas astonished the public. Handles carved from ivory, silver, or polished hardwood housed secret mechanisms so smooth that an attacker might not even realize you were armed, until the umbrella began doing things umbrellas were never meant to do. Some models came with engraved metalwork and velvet-lined sheaths, because if you're going to hide a weapon, it might as well match your waistcoat. These defensive umbrellas weren't merely for men. Women, too, carried parasols that looked delicate and ornamental, but hid blades sharp enough to discourage unwanted attention. Fashionable ladies strolling parks or promenades could rely on their parasols not just for shade, but also for safety. Nothing says respect my boundaries quite like a lace-covered accessory that contains a dagger. Of course, the umbrella's dual function presented some logistical challenges. For instance, one needed to remember whether the umbrella that kept you dry in the morning was the same umbrella you used for fencing practice the night before. Imagine pulling the wrong one open and realizing you've just tried to block rain with a sword. That's the kind of mistake that ruins both your day and your social standing. But the umbrella's popularity wasn't solely about defense. It was also about symbolism. Carrying a weapon disguised as a polite accessory spoke volumes about Victorian anxieties. People wanted safety, but they also wanted social camouflage. Self-defense had to be hidden behind civility, because appearances mattered just as much as survival. These umbrellas offered both reassurance and discretion, letting individuals feel prepared without appearing paranoid. Authorities occasionally expressed concern about the proliferation of such disguised weapons, especially when detecting them became nearly impossible. A gentleman could walk into any establishment carrying what appeared to be a rain-shielding tool, but was in fact a dueling-ready instrument. But regulations were slow, and the umbrella industry kept innovating faster than lawmakers could draft statutes. Stories circulated, some true, many exaggerated, of citizens successfully warding off attackers using their weaponized umbrellas. These tales added to the umbrella's mythos and contributed to its status as the unofficial symbol of polite self-defense. People repeated these stories with admiration and just a hint of fear, because you never quite knew which umbrella in the room had a sword inside. The weaponized umbrella ultimately became a perfect metaphor for Victorian life. Outwardly respectable, inwardly anxious, and always subtly dangerous. It symbolized the collision of elegance and fear, formality and necessity. In a world where crime felt close and social decorum felt closer, the umbrella stood ready to serve both functions without dripping on anyone's carpet. And now, with umbrellas convincingly transformed into covert armaments, we move to the next ingenious creation in the Victorian defensive wardrobe, the deceptively sweet yet shockingly sharp hatpin. If there is one item that perfectly captures the Victorian blend of elegance, danger, fashion, and social panic, it is the hatpin, a deceptively small accessory that transformed ordinary women into walking armories. To the untrained eye, a hatpin was simply a long metal pin used to secure elaborate hats to equally elaborate hairstyles. But in reality, it was a weapon so effective, so sharp, and so unexpectedly intimidating that newspapers occasionally described it with the same seriousness reserved for natural disasters. Let's begin with the hats themselves. Victorian women didn't merely wear hats, they built architectural marvels on their heads using feathers, ribbons, silk flowers, and sometimes enough structural support to qualify for building permits. These hats were not light, nor were they stable, and keeping them in place required something stronger than a gentle wish. Enter the hatpin, a needle-like metal rod anywhere from 6 to 12 inches long, designed to pierce through hair, hat, and occasionally the patience of anyone who stood too close. But the real story begins when women realized these pins had uses far beyond fashion. In a society where a woman walking alone was often viewed as either vulnerable or suspicious, the hatpin became a quiet symbol of independence and self-protection. If an unwanted hand grabbed an arm, a waist, or a shoulder, a quick jab with a hatpin sent a very clear message: please remove your hand or lose it. These pins were sharp enough to puncture leather, thick cloth, and the inflated ego of any man who thought he had the right to harass a stranger. Some were made by jewellers, featuring ornate heads crafted from enamel, silver or gemstones. Others were inexpensive nickel or brass, designed for the working woman who still wanted to defend herself with style. Regardless of cost, every hatpin shared one important characteristic: an extraordinary ability to ruin a troublemaker's evening. Stories spread quickly in newspapers about extraordinary hatpin encounters. Some were dramatic tales of women fighting off attackers with fierce precision. Others were exaggerated cautionary stories implying that women, left alone with sharp objects, would inevitably launch into spontaneous duels. Victorian journalists, never ones to avoid sensationalism, described hatpins as dangerous implements, miniature swords, and silent protectors. Public imagination did the rest. Naturally, rumours and urban legends blossomed. Tales circulated of hatpins so long that women could defend themselves without breaking stride. One popular story told of a woman who allegedly skewered a would-be thief through his coat sleeve, pinning him to a tram seat until authorities arrived. Was it true? Hard to say. Did the public believe it? Absolutely. Hatpins became the Victorian version of pepper spray mixed with mythic folklore. But as more women embraced the hatpin as a defensive tool, the controversy began. By the late Victorian and early Edwardian years, city councils started debating hatpin laws, claiming the pins were a threat to public safety. Ironically, these debates happened mainly because women were finally venturing out alone in greater numbers, and large portions of society didn't know what to do with women who were mobile, independent, and capable of poking rude men on purpose. Men who had previously enjoyed harassing women without consequences suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of sharp reminders that personal space existed. Predictably, some responded not by improving their behaviour, but by complaining that hatpins were too dangerous. The good news, women were safer. The bad news, men who behaved badly were not. Several cities attempted to regulate hatpin length, proposing maximum sizes of 7 or 8 inches. Others required women to cover the pin tips with decorative caps, safety nubs, intended to prevent accidental injuries in crowded spaces. These caps were adorable, ineffective, and frequently ignored. Women rightly pointed out that a capped hatpin made for poor self-defense, and that if society was truly concerned about public safety, Perhaps addressing harassment would be more productive than regulating accessories. Court cases popped up across Britain and America involving hatpins. Some were legitimate accidents. Passengers scratched on trains or pedestrians grazed in crowds. Others revealed more sinister motives, men trying to use the courts to punish women who had defended themselves. Judges, however, were often sympathetic. More than one ruling concluded, in essence, if you don't want to be stabbed, stop bothering women. The most fascinating part of the hatpin's history is how it represented the shifting role of women in society. As women worked, travelled and socialised independently, they needed tools, practical or hidden, that allowed them to navigate public life safely. Hatpins became both a fashion statement and a quiet form of empowerment. They were proof that a woman didn't need a bodyguard, a chaperone, or a hysterical warning in the newspaper. She simply needed a well-placed piece of metal and good aim. Hatpins also highlighted a cultural contradiction. Victorian society loved delicate femininity in theory, but in practice women were expected to defend themselves in overcrowded cities that were anything but delicate. So women adapted, turning fashion into armour and accessories into blades. Some late-century hatpins reached astonishing lengths, up to 14 inches, especially during the Gibson Girl era, when hats grew to the size of small ecosystems. These borderline spears were long enough to rival small swords, prompting renewed panic among city officials who feared carnage on public transport. Yet women continued carrying them, unbothered and unpersuaded by moral campaigns that insisted they should prioritise public comfort over personal safety. In the end, the hatpin became more than a tool. It became a cultural icon. It symbolised self-defence, independence, and the elegant refusal to tolerate nonsense. It allowed women to walk through city streets with their heads held high, not just because fashion demanded it, but because they had a literal stake in their own security. Victorians had a remarkable talent for turning everyday objects into unexpected weapons, but few inventions matched the delightful absurdity and brilliance of the muff revolver. At first glance, a hand muff appears to be the least threatening accessory in human history. A plush tube of fabric designed to keep a lady's hands warm while she walks. Soft, fuzzy, elegant, utterly non-violent. Or so one might assume, until a would-be attacker discovered that the cosy cylinder contained a fully functional revolver, pointed, primed and ready to ruin his evening. Victorian lesson: never underestimate someone keeping their hands warm. To understand why muff revolvers existed, we must remember that the Victorian era demanded that women dress for beauty, propriety, and seasonal survival simultaneously. Winter fashion required layers of skirts, corsets, bodices, and capes, yet fingers remained tragically exposed. Gloves helped, but when temperatures dipped low enough to freeze water pipes and personality traits, the hand muff became the ultimate cold weather accessory, and then someone, somewhere, had a thought that only a Victorian could love. What if this warm, fluffy tube also fired bullets? Thus, the muff-mounted firearm was born. How the muff revolver worked. The mechanics were surprisingly elegant. A small pocket was sewn discreetly inside the muff, lined to hold a lightweight revolver. The barrel aligned with a hidden opening, usually a buttonhole reinforced seam or artfully disguised slit. This allowed a woman to slip her hand inside, grip the gun and fire without ever removing the muff. No dramatic flourish, no raised weapon, no fumbling in panic. Just a calm squeeze of the trigger from within a cosy cocoon of fur or velvet. From the outside, the only visible clue was a tiny hole at the front of the muff, an opening small enough to pass as ventilation or a decorative seam. Attackers rarely noticed it. After all, nobody looks at a warm hand accessory and thinks, yes, that is definitely a firearm. That was the beauty of it. Who bought muff revolvers? Contrary to what modern imagination might assume, these disguised weapons weren't purchased exclusively by aristocratic ladies gliding through frosty parks. Middle-class women, working women walking home at night, governesses travelling alone, and shop girls navigating dim winter streets all found reasons to invest in this creative combination of warmth and deterrence. The muff revolver allowed women to carry protection without violating social etiquette or attracting unwanted attention. Victorian norms frowned upon women carrying visible weapons, but muffs. Everyone carried muffs. No one questioned them. They blended seamlessly into the feminine silhouette. And for women who faced harassment, loneliness on night streets, or the sharply rising crime rates of the later 19th century, the ability to conceal a defensive tool inside a fashionable item was nothing short of revolutionary. Manufacturers knew exactly what they were doing. Advertisements, cleverly placed in women's magazines and newspaper corners, promoted these firearms with a blend of reassurance and plausible deniability. They were described as discreet protectors, winter safeguards, or necessary aids for the lady traveller. Never, of course, a sneaky weapon disguised as a hand warmer, though everyone knew that's exactly what they were. Some muff revolvers came paired with beautifully crafted muffs, rabbit fur, ermine, fox, velvet trimmed with lace, or wool trimmed with ribbons. Others were sold separately to be inserted into any muff the owner already had. A few upscale models even incorporated custom holsters sewn directly into the lining, ensuring the revolver sat at the perfect angle for firing. Victorian ingenuity never stopped at functional. It insisted on precisely functional, beautifully disguised, and ideally matching your outfit. Practicality versus danger. While the muff revolver was undeniably ingenious, it was not without hazards. Firing a gun from within a bundle of fabric came with predictable risks, such as accidentally scorching the lining, creating unfortunate holes, setting parts of the muff smouldering, a good way to downgrade elegance to chaos, or recoiling so forcefully that the shooter briefly reconsidered her life choices. Yet for many women, these risks were preferable to walking unarmed through icy streets filled with eager pickpockets or overly familiar men. Better a singed muff than a dangerous encounter. Social reactions: confusion, admiration, and mild terror. Men, upon learning that women could carry revolvers concealed inside fluffy accessories, experienced a range of emotions from disbelief to existential dread. Some newspapers expressed concern that women were becoming too bold, which in Victorian language roughly translates to capable of defending themselves. Others praised the innovation as a necessary response to wintertime vulnerabilities. The police, for their part, seemed unsure what to make of the device. Technically, the revolver was a registered firearm, the muff was not. There was no law against sewing the two together, and even if there had been, it would have been impossible to enforce. Officers could hardly ask every woman in London to please empty her muff on command. Urban legends and near-mythical tales. Just as hatpins developed their legends, muff revolvers cultivated their own folklore. Stories circulated of women scaring off attackers with nothing more than a warning, "I advise you to step away." It sounded polite, until your brain processed that her hands were hidden and you had absolutely no idea what was going on inside that fur cylinder. One popular tale described a woman who supposedly fired through her muff to stop a dog from attacking her. Whether it happened or not, the story spread quickly, cementing the muff revolver's reputation as the wintertime equalizer. The symbolism behind the muff revolver. More than a weapon, the muff revolver represented a subtle rebellion. It allowed women to claim personal safety without challenging society's rigid expectations of femininity. They could protect themselves while still appearing soft, refined, and respectable. It was Victorian paradox at its finest. The era that adored modesty and restraint also invented firearms that lived inside cosy tubes of fur. In the end, the muff revolver proved one thing very clearly. In the Victorian world, danger wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it was hidden behind lace, velvet, and warmth, and carried by someone society mistakenly underestimated. Victorian gentlemen adored walking canes. They were fashionable, refined, and perfect for conveying the impression that one was worldly, mature, or perhaps just slightly more fragile than one actually was. But beneath that polished veneer lay a secret. Many Victorian canes were less decorative accessory and more portable weapon storage system. Sword canes, gun canes, poison dart canes, spring-loaded canes. If it could theoretically fit inside a hollow stick, some Victorian inventor tried it, patented it, and advertised it with suspicious enthusiasm. Gentlemen didn't merely stroll the streets, they patrolled them with disguised armories while pretending to limp. To appreciate the cane arsenal fully, you must first understand the status of the walking stick in Victorian society. For men, it wasn't just a prop, it was part of the uniform. Like the top hat or the cravat, the cane was an extension of one's elegance. Every gentleman had one, whether or not he needed it. And because social rules discouraged openly carrying weapons, the cane became the perfect Trojan horse for male self-defense. The sword cane, elegance meets mild violence, the crown jewel of the cane arsenal, was unquestionably the sword cane. At first glance, it looked perfectly ordinary. Polished wood, silver or ivory handle, discreet metal ferrule. But with a quick twist or press, the cane unsheathed a slim, razor-sharp blade that proved shockingly efficient at ruining a criminal's confidence. These blades came in different shapes. Some were straight like fencing foils, others curved like miniature sabres, and a few were triangular blades designed for maximum sturdiness and minimum bending, which was reassuring because nothing ruins a duel like a wobbly sword. Owners practiced unsheathing their sword canes in a single elegant motion, imagining themselves as protagonists in swashbuckling epics. Realistically, most never used them, but simply knowing you could turn a dapper stroll into a dramatic duel was enough to soothe the Victorian nerves. Gun canes, because why not put a firearm in a stick? Sword canes weren't enough for some gentlemen. They wanted their canes to deliver firepower. Enter the gun cane, a surprisingly sophisticated weapon featuring a small caliber firearm built directly into the shaft. The trigger was often hidden beneath the handle, and the barrel ran down the length of the cane. A man could simply point his walking stick, press the concealed trigger, and fire. It was self-defense blended with secrecy, though accuracy was questionable. Hitting a target with a cane gun required a steady hand, excellent aim, and the ability to pretend you were not firing a hidden weapon in the middle of the street. Some gun canes even used percussion caps or miniature shotgun shells. These were marketed to travellers exploring rural areas or colonies where wild animals, a Victorian euphemism for anything that isn't you, might pose a threat. Whether most users were more likely to scare themselves than their assailants remains a lively historical debate. Poison dart canes, the Victorian spy's dream. While sword and gun canes were dramatic, nothing screams over-prepared Victorian gentleman like a poison dart cane. Inspired by exoticism, colonial encounters, and far too many adventure novels, these canes housed tiny blowgun mechanisms. The owner could slide open a small panel, insert a narrow dart, and either blow through a hidden mouthpiece or activate a compressed air mechanism. The darts were sometimes dipped in irritating or paralysing substances, rarely lethal but certainly unpleasant. Manufacturers promoted these canes as ideal for forest excursions or useful for wilderness defence. Realistically, the average Victorian gentleman did not encounter many jungle predators on the streets of London, but the cane allowed him to pretend he might. Spring-loaded canes. Pure mechanical mischief. Perhaps the most whimsical inventions were spring-loaded canes, engineered with mechanisms that allowed the cane to extend a hidden spike, deploy a whistle, release a flare, or even eject the handle like a projectile. These devices showcased Victorian mechanical enthusiasm more than practicality. One model released a sudden metal spike for close-quarters defence. Another concealed a rapid extension baton. Yet another contained a coil spring that, when triggered, launched the handle outward like a small missile, a perfect tool for confusing an attacker or impressing acquaintances during awkward dinner parties. Spring-loaded canes often came with illustrated instruction manuals full of diagrams depicting mustachioed men demonstrating the device's capabilities with theatrical flair. Why the cane became a weapon Platform. Disguising weapons inside canes allowed gentlemen to navigate crowded urban areas without drawing suspicion. They could walk through foggy streets with the quiet confidence of someone who appeared unarmed but absolutely was not. The cane was discreet, fashionable, socially acceptable, easy to grip, and always in hand. It was essentially the Victorian version of multi-tool technology. While women hid defence tools in accessories like muffs or parasols, men hid theirs in sticks. Everyone concealed their anxiety behind elegance, public curiosity and quiet fear. Most civilians suspected that cane weapons existed, but the details were shrouded in mystery. Gentlemen rarely revealed what their canes contained. This secrecy led to whispers, dramatic newspaper illustrations, and occasional warnings from police to exercise caution around questionable canes, which was the least helpful advice ever printed. Stories circulated of men thwarting robberies with quick flicks of their wrists, revealing blades longer than expected. Some accounts were undoubtedly exaggerated. Victorians never let truth get in the way of a good panic, but the existence of weaponized canes was undeniable. Symbolism of the armed cane. More than a tool, the weapon cane embodied Victorian masculinity, refined on the outside, prepared for violence on the inside, always acting with controlled purpose. It was a paradox wrapped in polished wood and metal flourishes. The gentleman was expected to be civilized, but self-defense required readiness. Thus the cane became both ornament and arsenal, accessory and insurance, elegance and danger. It represented a world where safety was uncertain and appearance meant everything. Now that we've seen what gentlemen used to patrol the streets, it's time to explore the tool favoured by both civilians and police, something less subtle and far more willing to leave a mark, the infamous life preserver. If Victorian self-defence tools were ranked by their levels of elegance, discretion and plausibility, the life preserver would absolutely come last. Not because it was ineffective, quite the opposite, but because it had all the subtlety of a brick wrapped in leather, delivered directly to someone's face. While other Victorian weapons hid behind lace, velvet and polished wood, the life preserver proudly declared, "I am here to cause immediate regret." It was the closest thing Victorians had to holding up a sign that said, "I don't feel safe and I'm about to do something about it." A typical life preserver looked deceptively simple. A short club, usually 1 to 2 feet long, made of a sturdy wooden core wrapped tightly in leather. At the striking end sat a weighted knob, often filled with lead or iron, making the weapon compact but alarmingly powerful. Unlike sword canes or muff revolvers, it required no secret compartments, no mechanical innovations, and certainly no instruction manual. Its purpose was gloriously straightforward. Swing it and hope the person threatening you experiences an urgent change of life plans. The life preserver's origins, from nautical tool to street weapon. The life preserver's lineage may surprise you. Its earliest forms were used aboard ships, where sailors needed compact tools for managing ropes and occasionally discouraging unfriendly individuals. The design, short, heavy, easy to swing, was ideal for close-quarters conflict on unstable ground. Victorian police forces quickly recognised the practicality and borrowed it for urban patrols. Their logic was simple. Lengthy swords were impractical in tight alleys, guns were loud and socially fraught, and batons sometimes lacked the stopping power needed when facing desperate criminals. The life preserver, however, offered a middle ground, non-lethal in theory, extremely persuasive in practice. Once police officers adopted them, civilians followed. After all, if a weapon worked for law enforcement, surely it would be useful for protecting oneself on fog-choked streets where danger lurked behind lampposts, pub corners, and anyone who approached with suspicious enthusiasm. Design variations, Victorian creativity hits hard. Though the basic structure remained the same, Victorians found ways to enhance the life preserver. Coiled spring handles absorbed shock, letting the wielder strike harder without numbing their fingers. Knotted cords added extra grip and sometimes facilitated swinging the weapon like a flail. Lead-loaded heads increased striking force to levels best described as unwelcome. Decorative leatherwork ensured that even your blunt force trauma tool could be aesthetically pleasing. One model for the civilians was cleverly marketed as a night companion, a phrase so ominously vague it sounded like something a gothic novelist would keep under their pillow. Training, optional. Enthusiasm, required. This was one Victorian self-defense tool that didn't require finesse. No elegant wrist movements, no intricate mechanisms, no social camouflage. Defense instructors frequently emphasize the same three-step method. Grip firmly, aim, swing like your future depends on it. It was not an art, it was an exclamation point. But the simplicity was precisely why many Victorians loved it. A life preserver didn't require aristocratic dual training or a hidden mechanism to activate. Anyone, merchant, clerk or night watchman, could wield it with immediate effect. The tool democratized self-defense in a way few others did. Public perception, respect, fear, and the occasional injury. The life preserver was both admired and feared. Seeing one on a police officer's belt conveyed authority. Seeing one on a civilian's belt conveyed that this person either knew something dangerous about the neighbourhood or was preparing for a Dickensian showdown. Newspapers occasionally ran dramatic accounts of officers subduing criminals with these clubs. Some stories applauded the efficiency. Others warned that officers wielded them with too much enthusiasm, leaving suspects with bruises the size of moral dilemmas. Yet despite these concerns, the life preserver enjoyed a long era of popularity. It was inexpensive, effective, and brutally honest about its purpose. There was no pretending it served any delicate function. It wasn't a cane masquerading as a fashion accessory. It wasn't a weapon disguised as a winter luxury. It wasn't hidden inside a parasol, purse, or boot. It simply existed to hit things. Civilians and the need for blunt confidence. Carrying a life preserver was a statement. It said, "I walk alone at night. I don't trust the quiet in this alley. I live in a neighbourhood where the fog makes decisions for me." Victorian men and women who chose blunt tools over elegant concealed devices often did so for one simple reason. Intimidation works. Many attackers backed off the moment they saw that weighted club, and if intimidation failed, well, the club was ready for step 2, legal grey zones and not-so-grey bruises. While the Victorian legal system debated concealed weapons, hatpins, sword canes, and disguised pistols, the life preserver inhabited a peculiar middle ground. It wasn't hidden, so it wasn't technically deceitful, but it was undeniably dangerous, which raised eyebrows among city officials and moral commentators who argued that respectable citizens shouldn't carry weapons that could shatter bones. Yet police forces continued using them well into the late 19th century, and civilians kept buying them, suggesting that society collectively decided, "We know this is questionable, but have you seen the crime rates?" A symbol of Victorian pragmatism. Ultimately, the life preserver represented a different side of Victorian self-defense, less refined, more practical, unapologetically forceful. While sword canes and concealed pistols relied on secrecy and surprise, the life preserver relied on presence. It was the blunt embodiment of Victorian realism. If danger approached, subtlety was overrated. And thus, in a world filled with hidden blades and disguised firearms, the life preserver stood out by refusing to hide anything at all. Victorians adored scents, floral waters, citrus blends, lavender sachets tucked into drawers, rose oils dabbed behind ears, and enough cologne on some gentlemen to fumigate a ballroom. But beneath the era's obsession with smelling pleasant lay a much sharper truth. Sometimes fragrance wasn't just about allure. Sometimes it was about self-defense delivered through the nasal passages. Welcome to the strange and spicy world of potent perfume weapons, where a lady's dainty scent bottle might contain something far more startling than violets. Victorian society had strict expectations about women's behaviour. A woman was supposed to be graceful, restrained, pleasant-smelling, and entirely unarmed, at least according to the people who were not responsible for walking home alone after sunset. But if history proves anything, it's that women have always found ways to protect themselves, even within rigid social frameworks. And since Victorian fashion required women to carry small accessories, the perfume bottle became an ideal disguise, elegant, portable, and socially invisible. How perfumed weapons actually worked. At first glance, a self-defense perfume bottle looked no different from the ones used to apply sweet-smelling oils or eau de cologne. These bottles were often beautifully crafted from cut glass, porcelain, or silver filigree. But the clever twist lay inside. Manufacturers built hidden compartments or dual chambers within the bottle. One side held actual perfume to maintain the illusion. The other chamber held something far more alarming: ground pepper or cayenne mixtures, ammonia-based irritants, vinegar steeped with spicy compounds, or mild acids capable of searing eyes, not permanently but impressively. The mechanism varied. Some bottles had a rotating neck that switched between the fragrance chamber and the defensive chamber. Others had a secret pressure valve. Squeeze the bottle in just the right spot, and instead of a delicate mist of rosewater, the victim received a fierce, targeted spray of eye-watering punishment. The effect was immediate. One moment, you smell wonderful. The next, why does it feel like my soul is on fire? Why perfume was the perfect disguise. 3 reasons made perfume bottles a brilliant weapon. They were always carried. Women of all classes kept scent bottles in pockets or reticules. No one questioned them, they were socially permissible. Carrying a club or pistol might raise eyebrows. Carrying perfume, pure femininity. They were quick. A startled attacker had no time to process what was happening until his eyes were streaming. Furthermore, perfume bottles were designed to be held comfortably in one hand, a crucial detail when dealing with surprise encounters in narrow Victorian streets lit by unreliable gas lamps. A popular tool. Among urban women, while upper-class ladies used perfume defensively mostly during late-night carriage rides or theatre returns, working-class women found them especially valuable. Factory workers, shop girls, and domestic servants walking home after long shifts frequently faced harassment. A concealed irritant spray was effective and required no brute strength, just swift aim and a calm wrist. There are recorded accounts, and several unverified but widely circulated stories, of women routing attackers with scent bottles alone. One story involved a milliner who, fed up with repeated unwanted advances, unleashed a pepper mist blast that sent her harasser staggering into a horse trough. Another tale told of a flower seller who kept a vinegar bottle of justice for market-day troublemakers. Were these embellished? Absolutely. Did Victorian readers enjoy them? Completely. The ammonia bottle, a particularly intense invention. Some inventive manufacturers took things further and developed ammonia bottles with breakable inner capsules. A gentle squeeze would crack the ampule, releasing a concentrated vapour capable of repelling even the most determined criminal, or anyone with a functioning sense of smell. These were especially popular among women travelling alone on trains, where enclosed spaces magnified both danger and effectiveness. If an unwanted hand reached across the compartment, one sniff of ammonia ended the conversation before it began. Perfume weapons in advertisements. Victorian marketing danced an elegant line between subtlety and honesty. Advertisements rarely said perfect for incapacitating harassers, but they did use phrases such as a lady's safeguard in uncertain company, for sudden emergencies, discreet protection enclosed in a charming form, and, on one memorable trade card, defence most delicate. One particularly bold company marketed a perfume bottle with a small pamphlet titled, "For use when gentlemen are no longer gentle." Victorians excelled at politely phrased threats. The social reaction, confusion, admiration, and mild moral panic. Not everyone approved of weaponized fragrances. Some commentators argued that such tools encouraged unladylike behaviour. Others worried that young women might accidentally spray the wrong person, especially in crowded settings like omnibuses or public squares. One newspaper even speculated dramatically that these perfume weapons might bring chaos to public gatherings if a lady should panic unnecessarily. Despite the hand-wringing, no laws specifically targeted perfume weapons. Unlike long hatpins or visible clubs, perfume bottles were simply too innocuous looking for lawmakers to regulate. And even if they had tried, enforcement would have been laughably impossible. What officer would confiscate a woman's scent bottle and test it by spraying himself in the face? Exactly. The symbolism, hidden strength behind grace. Perfumed weapons encapsulated a powerful contradiction in Victorian femininity. Women were expected to be delicate, peaceful, and sweet-smelling, yet the world they navigated was anything but. The result was a defensive tool that combined beauty and function, fragrance and fire. These bottles allowed women to remain within the bounds of social expectation while quietly arming themselves against real dangers. A woman could look refined while carrying a chemical surprise so potent it could make a grown man reconsider all his life choices. In the end, elegance really can sting. Potent perfumes were not as dramatic as swords or as technologically bold as gun canes, but their genius lay in subtlety. They offered quick, effective protection in a world where women were often left to defend themselves creatively. And if a man got too close, well, he would leave smelling like regret. Victorians loved gadgets, especially gadgets that made loud noises for dramatic effect. And in a world where shouting for help was considered both unrefined and unreliable, people began turning to mechanical inventions that could scream on their behalf. These devices became the Victorian solution to yelling when you didn't have the lung capacity, the courage, or the social permission to do it yourself. Enter the world of personal alarms, a symphony of springs, gears, bells, whistles, and human desperation wrapped into small handheld contraptions with names like the burglar alarm pocket device, emergency night watch gong, and the ever-reassuring automatic protector for ladies. Why Victorians needed mechanical screaming? The Victorian city environment was noisy. Carriages clattered, street vendors hollered, factories roared, and drunken debates spilled from pubs at all hours. Combine that with thick fog and poor nighttime visibility, and you had a dangerous soundscape where cries for help vanished into the ambient chaos. Victorian etiquette didn't help either. A well-bred woman was not supposed to shriek unless absolutely necessary, and even then, she was expected to shriek at a socially acceptable volume. Gentlemen, meanwhile, avoided yelling because it appeared undignified. So how do you alert others that you're in trouble without compromising your dignity? Simple, you let a small mechanical box scream for you. The burglar alarm pocket device, a Victorian panic button. Perhaps the most popular alarm was a palm-sized object shaped like a rectangular metal case. It looked harmless, almost like a card holder or snuff box, but inside was a spring-loaded mechanism connected to a tiny but incredibly loud bell. When activated, usually by pulling a pin or pressing a concealed trigger, the device unleashed a continuous ringing sound so sharp and relentless that even the most determined criminal would either flee or pause long enough for the victim to escape. Victorian advertisements boasted that the alarm could be heard 2 streets away, which, depending on the wind and fog, could mean anywhere from 3 meters to half the city. Manufacturers marketed it as ideal for women walking alone at night, travellers in unfamiliar neighbourhoods, clerks carrying money bags, and anyone who believed danger respected a schedule it did not. The device's simplicity made it reliable. It couldn't jam, it didn't require strength, and most importantly, it kept screaming long after the user had run for help. Whistles, small, shrill, and socially acceptable. While mechanical bells dominated the alarm industry, whistles also carved out a prominent niche. Some were made of brass, others of nickel, and the fanciest models were silver-plated and engraved. Whistles were a favourite tool for schoolteachers, factory supervisors, night watchmen, and anyone who wanted a burst of attention without punching someone. Ladies also carried them, often tucked inside handbags or suspended on necklaces disguised as jewellery. The Victorian version of self-defense jewellery didn't stab or burn. It simply produced a noise capable of waking a napping policeman. One popular model promised a shriek as piercing as the call of distress in the darkest alley. Another advertised its pitch as unmistakably alarming, a sales tactic that left buyers wondering what a mistakably alarming whistle might sound like. Noise devices for the truly prepared. But Victorians never stopped at simple solutions. Some alarm tools were extravagant, bordering on comedic. Spring-loaded ratchets that produced rapid-fire clacking noises. Miniature gongs that could be struck repeatedly using a lever. Cylinder alarms that once activated spun frantically while emitting metallic screeches best described as a very angry tea kettle. Double bell alarms designed for extra emphasis, as if being attacked required musical harmony. One model even claimed to arouse the slumbering household with enough force to discourage the most hardened rogue. It remains unclear which would terrify an intruder more, the alarm or the thought of a household that slumbers through that kind of racket. Women and the rise of the alarm industry. Victorian women quickly became the primary consumers of pocket alarms. Unlike pistols, blade weapons or clubs, noisemakers were considered respectable. They required no physical confrontation. They did not violate feminine expectations. They simply summoned help while allowing the user to maintain a delicate posture of alarmed propriety. Some etiquette guides even recommended them. One called them the appropriate recourse for ladies who find themselves confronted by discourteous individuals. In Victorian language, discourteous individuals meant anyone from pickpockets to men who believed a woman walking alone was an invitation for unsolicited conversation. Did the alarms actually work? Surprisingly, yes, sometimes spectacularly. Criminals often relied on darkness, silence, and isolation to intimidate victims. A sudden eruption of metallic clamour disrupted that strategy completely. In newspaper accounts, attackers were frequently startled into fleeing, sometimes tripping over their own boots in the process. However, alarms worked best in populated areas. In extremely isolated streets, the device still served one vital purpose. It shocked the attacker long enough to create an opening for escape. And even if nobody heard the alarm, the attacker certainly did. This psychology of noise, fear, inaudible form noise, especially unexpected noise, plays a powerful psychological role. The Victorians understood this instinctively. A loud alarm suggested vulnerability and danger simultaneously. Vulnerability from the victim, danger toward the aggressor. It signaled to the attacker, "You've lost control of the situation." Victorian criminals weren't typically eager to be caught. They didn't enjoy crowds gathering or lanterns being lit. They especially didn't enjoy the idea of a policeman stomping toward the noise with righteous Victorian disapproval. Fashionable designs for the style-conscious. While some alarms were purely utilitarian, others catered to high society. These came decorated with floral etchings, mother-of-pearl inlays, delicate scrollwork, filigree casings, or monograms so ornate they practically apologized for existing. These luxurious models blended seamlessly into a lady's reticule. To an observer, she was simply carrying a stylish accessory. In reality, she held a device capable of unleashing a sound comparable to a fire drill. Symbolism of the mechanical scream. More than a tool, Victorian personal alarms symbolized a shift in social norms. As cities grew more crowded and chaotic, people acknowledged that personal safety could not always rely on bystanders or authorities. So they armed themselves, not with violence, but with volume. In a sense, these alarms represented Victorian vulnerability and ingenuity at once. They were portable reminders that while society demanded decorum, real life often demanded something louder. Pocket pistols and derringers were the Victorian answer to a simple question. What if self-defense could fit in your pocket, blend in with your outfit, and still ruin an attacker's evening? These small, elegant firearms were designed for people who wanted protection, but didn't want to advertise it. They were marketed to middle-class men and increasingly to women, because nothing says empowered like a weapon the size of a walnut that can convince a criminal to reconsider all his life choices. The rise of the petite firearm. As cities expanded and the streets became more unpredictable, Victorians realised that carrying a full-size revolver was impractical. Large pistols were heavy, conspicuous and socially awkward. You couldn't casually tuck one into a coat pocket without looking like someone preparing for a duel, a robbery, or an extremely tense dinner party. Enter the pocket pistol, a compact, lightweight firearm designed to be concealed easily. Manufacturers rushed to fill the market, offering pistols with names like the Ladies' Model Protector, the Pocket Guardian, and the Miniature Bulldog. These pistols were small enough to fit into a waistcoat reticule or sewn-in pocket, and ornate enough to appear more like jewellery than weaponry. But if their size fooled anyone into thinking they were harmless, that belief evaporated quickly once the trigger was pulled. Designed for elegance, built for purpose. One of the most popular styles was the Derringer, a single-shot or multi-shot pistol named after American gunsmith Henry Derringer. Although originally a Western icon, the Derringer found its way into Victorian Europe, where it was embraced for its blend of discretion and punch. Victorian Derringers often featured ivory or pearl grips, engraved barrels and frames, polished nickel plating, floral designs along the handle, and cases lined with velvet or silk. Some were so beautifully crafted that they looked like miniature works of art, a dangerous ornament you could display on a dressing table or slip into a pocket before heading out for the evening. But beneath the ornate designs lay real stopping power. A close-range shot from a Derringer was not something a criminal ignored lightly. A weapon for the middle classes. Pocket pistols weren't just tools of aristocrats or adventurers. They were priced and marketed for the growing Victorian middle class. Rising crime rates, sensational journalism, and the growing independence of men and women alike created a demand for discreet, affordable weapons. Shopkeepers, clerks, travelling salesmen, governesses, and women who walked home from factories at night all became potential buyers. In advertisements and catalogues, manufacturers used polite language to describe the pistols, suitable for emergencies, an excellent companion during travel, an item of great reassurance for ladies, practical for those who often find themselves out after dusk. Victorians excelled at implying danger without explicitly stating it. Pocket pistols for women. Discretion meets determination. Women were a crucial market. As social mobility increased and women ventured into public life more frequently, they needed tools that helped them navigate a world that wasn't always kind or safe. But women couldn't carry obvious weapons without raising eyebrows. So manufacturers created pistols that blended seamlessly into feminine fashion. Pistols that fit perfectly in a small reticule. Pistols disguised inside ornate cases. Pistols with decorative handles matching popular jewellery motifs. Some even came with small mirrored lids, allowing the owner to check her hair before, during or after, contemplating self-defense. Etiquette manuals, never ones to stay silent on anything, began including lines suggesting that a lady travelling alone might benefit from a discreet defensive object available at hand. Everyone knew what that meant. Nobody stated it plainly. How the pistols worked. Simple, quick and up-close pocket. Pistols generally fired small caliber rounds. They weren't designed for long-distance heroics, but for close encounters. In fact, their short barrels made aiming somewhat optional. The goal was to create enough shock to escape. Reloading was not fast. Many Derringers held only 1 or 2 shots, but in Victorian self-defence, one well-timed shot was often enough. Criminals tended not to stick around after hearing a gunfire blast echo through a foggy street. Compact but not cute, the dangers of misuse. Because of their size, pocket pistols came with risks. Their limited grip space made recoil unpredictable. Their safety mechanisms were sometimes minimal or non-existent, and due to their popularity, accidents were not unheard of. Newspapers occasionally reported mishaps like pistols firing during carriage rides, pockets catching triggers, handbags discharging unexpectedly, or gentlemen forgetting they'd loaded their pistol and discovering it at the worst possible moment. Nonetheless, the practicality outweighed the hazards. Better a risky pistol than no defence at all. Law enforcement's mixed feelings. Police opinions on pocket pistols varied. Some officers appreciated that civilians could protect themselves. Others feared the potential for escalation. But since pocket pistols were openly sold and widely carried, all authorities accepted them as a social reality, another artifact of Victorian anxiety wrapped in decorative metal. However, officers made one thing clear: if you fired your pistol, you were expected to justify it. Victorian courts didn't like unnecessary violence, even when committed with stylish miniatures. Symbolism, power in small packages. Pocket pistols represented something deeper than self-defense. They symbolized control in a society obsessed with propriety and vulnerability. These weapons were not designed for aggression, but for escape, confidence, and independence. For men, they reinforced autonomy in unpredictable cities. For women, they provided a rare form of agency in a society that limited their choices. Owning a pocket pistol said, "I am small, but I am not unprotected." In the end, tiny guns, big impact. Though overshadowed by the more theatrical inventions of the era, pocket pistols and derringers became essential tools in the Victorian self-defense landscape. Small enough to hide, stylish enough to pass as accessories, and powerful enough to make any attacker reconsider, they proved that sometimes the greatest threats and the greatest protections come in the smallest packages. Victorians were experts at combining elegance with unexpected violence, but perhaps no invention reflected this more perfectly than the revolver purse. A seemingly harmless handbag that could, at a moment's notice, transform into a ranged deterrent. This was not the clumsy swing your bag and hope for the best approach. No, this was precise, discreet, mechanical self-defense, the original bag secured. At first glance, a revolver purse looked like any other handbag of the era. Soft leather, embroidered velvet, beadwork, or fine tapestry designs. It might have decorative clasps, tassels, or gilt edging. Nothing about its appearance screamed hidden weapon. In fact, the beauty of the purse was part of its disguise. No one suspected that behind a panel of dainty embroidery lurked a gun barrel waiting for an impolite stranger to approach. The anatomy of a purse that shot back. The revolver purse wasn't just a bag with a gun thrown inside. These were carefully engineered tools with integrated firing mechanisms. Designers built special compartments inside the lining, securing a small revolver at a fixed angle. The barrel pointed outward through a tiny reinforced opening, so small it might be mistaken for wear in the fabric or part of a pattern. The firing mechanisms varied, but the most common activation methods included pulling a discrete internal cord or strap, pressing a hidden button sewn into the side panel, squeezing a reinforced patch in the lining, or on some higher-end models, activating a pressure trigger embedded inside the handle for a truly cinematic effect. The owner simply held the purse naturally, gripped the right section, and fired without ever opening the bag. The idea was to catch attackers off guard, because someone expecting a scream or a struggle would not expect a handbag to suddenly bark like pocket thunder. Who used revolver purses? These devices found buyers across a surprising range of social classes. Upper-class ladies purchased them for travel, especially on overnight trains, where isolated compartments made the imagination run wild. Middle-class women bought them for evening outings, commutes from office jobs, or errands after dusk. These women often walked alone more frequently than their wealthier counterparts, making concealed defensive tools especially appealing. Working-class women sometimes purchased simplified versions featuring blades rather than guns. These still qualified as revolver purses because the blade deployed mechanically, either sliding out through the bottom seam or popping out of a hidden slot like a Victorian switch purse. The universal appeal was clear. A purse was always on hand, always socially acceptable, and always accessible. Unlike firearms hidden under skirts or inside bulky coats, A purse was naturally held, making it ideal for quick defensive action. Fashion meets firearm design. Manufacturers knew that if they wanted women to buy these devices, the purses needed to look irresistible. And so began a glorious era where gunsmiths collaborated with fashion artisans. The resulting purses were almost absurdly ornate, featuring quilted silk interiors, brass or silver gun mounts, delicate lace overlays, jeweled clasps that doubled as safety switches, and embroidered panels concealing weapon ports. Some high-end makers even offered custom monograms over the firing aperture, proving that Victorian self-defense could be both highly personal and extremely stylish. Were these purses practical? Surprisingly, yes. Though firing a gun through a handbag might sound chaotic, revolver purses were designed for extremely close-range self-defense, the kind of distance where a struggle was imminent and escape was uncertain. Attackers often relied on surprise and proximity. A woman fumbling to draw her weapon from inside a bag was vulnerable, but a woman who could simply press a hidden panel and fire instantly had the upper hand. With the purse held naturally against the body, the weapon's position remained steady, and if recoil threatened to disrupt aim, not a problem, the purse absorbed much of the shock. Magazine writers praised the device for allowing women to protect themselves without needing to expose a weapon, lift a skirt, or struggle to open a reticule in the dark. Bladed variants for the less explosive approach. Not all purses held firearms. Some models deployed spring-loaded daggers, retractable spikes, razor-sharp needle blades inside the clasp, or cutting edges tucked into decorative tassels. These blade-based purses appealed to those wary of firearms or unable to afford the revolver components. They remained effective deterrents. Nothing ruins an attacker's confidence quite like discovering that a gentle-looking handbag has teeth. Law enforcement's reaction. Police officers viewed revolver purses with mixed emotions. On the one hand, they provided vulnerable citizens with an effective way to defend themselves. On the other hand, the idea of civilians walking around with concealed weapons disguised as fashion accessories made regulation and prediction almost impossible. Still, because the firearms inside were legally registered weapons, the purse itself was not considered contraband. Law enforcement largely shrugged and accepted the reality of Victorian creativity. Public fascination and rumour. The notion of a woman carrying a gun purse captured the public imagination. Newspapers printed fictionalized tales of daring rescues, foiled robberies, and women firing from within their handbags with perfect precision. Fiction rarely concerns itself with recoil realism. Urban myths flourished. A lady on a Parisian boulevard supposedly sent 2 muggers scrambling with her purse alone. A London widow allegedly used hers to frighten away a street gang without firing a shot. Just revealing the mechanism did the trick. A travelling companion once warned a man not to agitate the lady's purse, a line so cryptic it sparked speculation for weeks. Whether these stories were true mattered little. They reinforced one essential truth. You could never be entirely sure what a Victorian woman's purse might contain. Symbolic power in a small package. More than a weapon, the revolver purse symbolized a quiet shift in autonomy. It allowed women to carry force without compromising femininity. It fused the domestic, the decorative, and the deadly into a single object. In an era that prized modesty and restraint, the revolver purse whispered a different message. Appear delicate if you must, but never helpless. The Victorian bicycle boom created freedom, independence, and an entirely new category of danger, one that required its own strange catalogue of defensive tools. As more people took to the streets on 2 wheels, they discovered that cycling came with threats ranging from aggressive dogs to aggressive men, not to mention potholes large enough to swallow your dignity whole. Women in particular endured an additional foe, the public's overwhelming judgment of anyone bold enough to wear bloomers. To handle this new frontier of mobility and mayhem, Victorians did what they did best. They invented gadgets. Unnecessary, dramatic, sometimes absurd gadgets, but occasionally effective ones. Thus was born the highly niche industry of bicycle self-defense, where ingenuity met pedal power and etiquette met chaos. Cyclists versus dogs, a rivalry for the ages. Before cars roamed the streets, dogs considered public roads their domain. Many were free-roaming, territorial, or extremely enthusiastic about chasing anything with wheels. Cyclists quickly learned that being pursued by a barking blur of fur while balancing on a wobbly frame was a deeply unpleasant experience. To counter this, inventors created cycling whips, thin flexible rods attached to the handlebars or frame, designed to flick downward toward an approaching dog without upsetting the rider's balance. These whips were not intended to harm so much as to warn, though realistically any dog receiving a sudden sting from a lady in bloomers may have questioned its life choices. Advertisements promised that even the most determined dog shall desist. Victorian marketing was never shy. The bloomers controversy, danger from men not dogs. Women riding bicycles faced a different kind of pursuit. Relentless commentary from men unprepared to see women enjoying freedom or wearing anything resembling trousers. Bloomers, the rational cycling attire of the era, caused an outsized moral meltdown among traditionalists. Some men jeered, others followed. A few attempted to grab handlebars in misguided displays of correction. So women armed themselves not just with resolve but with tools. One such device was the handlebar-mounted alarm horn designed to blare a sound so sharp and startling that anyone within range, critic, creep, or innocent bystander, reconsidered approaching. These horns were not ordinary bells, they were pneumatic shriek machines capable of producing tones that could, according to one catalogue, frighten stray dogs, alert pedestrians, and, if necessary, disturb the intentions of undesirable gentlemen. There is no record of ghosts being present during Victorian cycling. Yet advertisements insisted the horns were loud enough to frighten them too. This tells you everything you need to know about Victorian marketing confidence. Bicycle pistols. Because why should walking get all the firearms? Some cyclists took defence one step further by adopting bicycle-mounted pistols, small firearms fitted into brackets near the handlebars or frame. The idea was simple. If someone or something pursued you, you could fire downward or sideways without dismounting. Most models were derringer-sized and fired warning shots rather than precise projectiles. Since accuracy while riding was questionable at best, balancing, steering and aiming simultaneously required Olympic-level coordination, these pistols served primarily as audible deterrents. The true function was intimidation, the message that you may be riding gracefully through the park, but you are absolutely prepared to escalate if necessary. The cycling dagger, hidden in the frame, some bicycle manufacturers experimented with concealed blades built into the bike frame, because Victorians simply could not stop hiding weapons inside everyday objects. A quick pull of a latch near the handlebars released a slim dagger or spike. This allowed riders to keep their distance from attackers or cut ropes if someone attempted the bizarre but not entirely unheard of tactic of pulling cyclists down with makeshift snares. While not common, these devices gained enough notoriety that newspapers occasionally warned criminals not to assume cyclists were unarmed. The ingenious and slightly terrifying booby-trap pedals. One short-lived invention involved spring-loaded pedals that released a burst of irritant powder if tampered with. These were intended to deter thieves from stealing bicycles while the owner was absent. Though clever in concept, the execution led to several unintended incidents of powder blasts aimed directly at innocent people who merely bumped into parked bikes. Public enthusiasm waned accordingly. But as with many Victorian inventions, practicality was optional. Creativity was mandatory. Women cyclists and self-defense instruction. The rise of women cyclists triggered a wave of instructional pamphlets and club lectures devoted specifically to self-defense on wheels. These guides offered everything from how to maintain balance while fending off harassment to how to use a cycling whip effectively without veering into hedges. One particularly bold manual included advice such as keep your feet firmly upon the pedals to maintain stability during confrontation. A sudden increase of speed may bewilder an aggressor. If pursued, do not hesitate to sound your horn persistently. Another insisted that a confident cycling posture was itself a deterrent, which might have been true, but a revolver purse or bicycle pistol certainly enhanced the effect. Social reactions, amusement, alarm, and disapproval. Victorian society had mixed feelings about cycle self-defense. Some praised cyclists, especially women, for taking responsibility for their safety. Others found the tools scandalous, claiming they were unladylike or encouraged wild behaviour. Yet public opinion was increasingly irrelevant. Cycling represented newfound independence, and with independence came the desire and need for personal protection. Of course, not everyone approved of cyclists firing warning shots or wielding whips like mobile cavalry units, but the Victorians were nothing if not adaptable. Police officers learned to recognise the sudden, unmistakable honk of a cyclist fending off harassment. Dogs learned to respect the perimeter of a swiftly moving wheel. The symbolism of bicycle defence. Bicycle self-defence represented something larger than tools or gadgets. It marked a shift in autonomy. The bicycle freed Victorians from relying solely on carriages, cabs, or foot travel. It created a new public space, fast, fluid, unpredictable, and new responsibilities. For many women, cycling was their first taste of physical independence, and self-defense gear empowered them further. Whether they carried whips, horns, or concealed pistols, these riders transformed from passive targets into capable, prepared individuals. In conclusion, a wild ride worth protecting. Victorian bicycle defence tools ranged from practical to bizarre, but all served the same purpose: helping riders navigate streets where danger, disapproval, and the occasional territorial dog lurked around every bend. These inventions showed that Victorian creativity knew no limits, and that when society scoffed at bloomers, women responded by ringing horns loud enough to wake the ancestors. Victorian gentlemen loved refinement, restraint, and good posture, but they also lived in cities where a leisurely evening stroll could quickly turn into an unplanned fistfight. Enter Victorian brass knuckles, also called knuckle dusters, elegant, engraved, sometimes gold-plated fist accessories designed to turn a polite gentleman's punch into something considerably more memorable. They were marketed as practical, compact, and ideal for self-defense. Spoiler, they were none of those things, but Victorians adored them anyway. A weapon that fit in the palm of your hand. Knuckle dusters were simple in theory, a metal frame with openings for the fingers, worn across the knuckles to reinforce a punch. But Victorians transformed this straightforward idea into something uniquely excessive. They couldn't resist adding embellishments, flourishes, inscriptions, and designs that made the device look more like an expensive paperweight than a weapon capable of breaking noses. Materials varied widely: polished brass, the traditional choice, steel for the practical-minded, silver and gold for the fashion-forward, or even carved bone or horn for the gentleman with complicated tastes. Some models incorporated decorative etchings of lions, eagles, ivy vines, or the owner's initials, because nothing says I uphold decorum like a monogrammed hand-to-hand combat enhancer. Marketed to the gentleman who wanted quiet violence. Unlike flashy weapons such as sword canes or pistol handbags, knuckle dusters were marketed as discreet tools for the urban gentleman. The ads emphasised that they could be carried without detection, slipped into a pocket and deployed only if necessary, which, according to Victorian paranoia, was any moment between leaving your house and reaching the next gas lamp. Typical advertisements use language like "a gentleman's confidence in compact form," "assures protection without attracting attention," "suitable for situations requiring firmness." Firmness was, of course, Victorian code for punching someone so hard they reconsider the last 3 days of their lives. Why they became popular despite being dubious. Brass knuckles gained traction because they appealed to 3 Victorian anxieties: urban crime, people feared being caught unprepared; social expectations, it was unseemly for a gentleman to brandish obvious weapons; masculinity, Some men wanted a way to feel powerful without breaking social norms or their own fingers. Knuckle dusters provided a kind of macho security blanket. They were small enough to hide but dramatic enough to make men feel ready for danger. Whether they could actually handle danger was another matter. The problem, they weren't practical at all. Despite being advertised as ideal for self-defense, brass knuckles were not, at least not in the way Victorians hoped. Their drawbacks included extremely short range. You had to be uncomfortably close to your attacker. High risk of injuring your own hand if used improperly. Legal grey areas that caused headaches. And the simple fact that punching someone usually escalated rather than solved problems. Self-defense instructors of the time were sceptical. Some noted that gentlemen unused to fist-fighting were likely to break their own fingers even with knuckle dusters. Others warned that striking the wrong part of the skull could leave the wielder with an immediate philosophical respect for medical science. But practicality didn't matter. Brass knuckles were symbolic, and Victorians loved symbols. The gentleman's dilemma: aggression versus appearances. Victorian masculinity lived in a constant contradiction. Men were expected to be strong but never crude, capable of defence but never violent, protective but never overtly confrontational. Brass knuckles slid neatly into this contradiction. They allowed a man to be armed, ready and dignified, or so the ads claimed. He could carry them without signalling bloodlust. He could defend himself without drawing a blade or firing a gun. And if anyone questioned the oddly heavy object in his coat pocket, he could casually describe it as a paperweight or a curiosity. The Victorian era adored plausible deniability, creative and questionable variations. Never satisfied with simplicity, Victorian inventors made specialised knuckle duster models, knuckle dusters with built-in palm spikes for enhanced negotiation, foldable knuckle dusters that collapsed like pocket knives, combination tools featuring bottle openers, screwdrivers or cigar cutters, because who doesn't want a multi-tool that can both uncork wine and deliver a crunching blow? Decorative collector's editions too beautiful to use but too dangerous looking to leave lying around. One particularly bizarre model included a spring-loaded mechanism that delivered a slight jab with each punch, as if Victorian engineering wanted to add both flourish and physical comedy to violence. Law enforcement's reaction: worried, confused and resigned. Police forces were not thrilled about knuckle dusters. They were harder to regulate than firearms and more concealable than clubs. Some cities attempted to ban carrying them, especially in tavern districts where a simple argument could escalate into a late-night knuckle recital. But enforcement was inconsistent. Unless a person was caught in the act of using the device, it was almost impossible to prove intent. And since brass knuckles could plausibly be described as tools, officers often had to shrug and let the matter go. The social image: toughness without the mess. For some Victorian men, knuckle dusters weren't about self-defense at all. They were about image. Carrying them conveyed a subtle message: I am refined, but I can also ruin your evening if required. This was especially true in rougher neighbourhoods, where young men wanted to appear formidable without carrying a weapon that suggested actual criminality. A gentleman might never use his brass knuckles, but owning them provided psychological reassurance. It was the Victorian equivalent of installing a security system you secretly hope never activates. Symbolism: a paradox in metal. Form: brass knuckles encapsulated a uniquely Victorian tension, the desire to appear civilised while preparing for chaos. They were polished yet brutal, decorative yet dangerous, compact yet bold. Their true value wasn't found in street brawls, but in how they made the owner feel. More secure, more assertive, more capable of dealing with threats that newspapers insisted lurked around every corner. They weren't practical, but they were comforting. Victorian Britain produced many unusual inventions, but few combined fashion, engineering and pure mischief quite like the revolver ring. A tiny, glittering piece of jewellery that could fire a miniature shot or reveal a concealed blade. This was the perfect accessory for anyone who believed that self-defense should be elegant, discreet and perhaps slightly unhinged. The revolver ring didn't just whisper danger, it announced, engaged to chaos. The origins. When jewellery became weaponry, Victorian jewellers were already creating lavish rings, gold filigree, gemstone clusters, intricate engravings. But as personal defence tools rose in popularity, some inventive artisans thought, why stop at beauty? Why not add firepower? And so began the era of covert weaponry embedded in what looked like romantic tokens. The idea appealed to people who needed protection, but wanted it to remain absolutely invisible until the moment of necessity. Unlike hatpins, canes, or purse pistols, the revolver ring required no searching, no drawing, no adjusting. It simply needed a finger, and the willingness to use something so small and peculiar that even attackers didn't believe it existed. How the revolver ring worked. Mini firepower, maximum drama. At its core, a revolver ring was a tiny single-shot firearm integrated into a metal band. The mechanisms varied across designs, but the basic components included a tiny barrel spool, often less than an inch, a pinfire or percussion cap system capable of igniting a miniature cartridge, a trigger stud that could be pressed with the thumb or another finger, a rotating or hinged top to load and arm the device. Some models had a barrel that pointed outward from the top of the ring. Others positioned the barrel along the underside of the finger, making the direction of fire incredibly personal and requiring attention during gesturing. The ammunition was small, typically little pellets meant to startle, wound, or deter rather than kill. The gunpowder charge was minimal but absolutely enough to stun an attacker who expected jewellery, not gunfire. Blade rings, silent, swift, and subtle. Not all revolver rings fired bullets. Some housed concealed blades, spring-loaded or hinged, that could be deployed with a flick or press. These blades were tiny but sharp, ideal for slicing bindings, cutting through rope, or inflicting quick defensive wounds. They were popular among travellers, nighttime pedestrians, and individuals who wanted protection without relying on noisy weapons. Blade rings came in two general styles. Claw-like talons that jutted out from the ring's top when triggered. Hidden edges along the inside of the band revealed only when pressed with deliberate force. Some jewellers crafted rings with both features, a blade and a firing mechanism, though these were rare and alarmingly complicated. Who bought these rings? Contrary to expectation, revolver rings were not just novelties for wealthy eccentrics. They appealed to several demographics. 1. Gentlemen who travelled often, railway journeys and nighttime walks were unpredictable. A ring offered silent confidence. 2. Women seeking subtle protection. Unlike knives or pistols, rings did not violate feminine expectations. Many designs even appeared delicate, hiding their true purpose behind pearls or small diamonds. 3. Detectives, clerks, and money carriers. Anyone transporting valuables knew the risk of robbery. A ring allowed immediate defence without reaching for a hidden pocket or bag. 4. Curious collectors of peculiar gadgets. Victorian gadget enthusiasm was boundless. A miniature gun built into jewellery, irresistible. Why they were marketed as practical, they weren't. Advertisements painted revolver rings as brilliant innovations. They praised their lightweight, their concealability, their instant usage, and their ability to discourage villains before they can grasp you. But in reality, the accuracy was questionable at best. The recoil could surprise wearers. Misfiring near one's own fingers was not ideal. The tiny barrel limited power and precision. And loading these rings in a hurry required the dexterity of a watchmaker. Yet buyers loved them, because Victorian practicality was never purely practical. It was half problem-solving, half performance. Manufacturing, where jewellers became engineers. Creating a revolver ring required near microscopic craftsmanship. Jewellers collaborated with gunsmiths to design pieces that balanced aesthetics with hidden mechanisms. Some rings displayed false gemstones that hinged open to reveal chambers. Others hid the trigger beneath decorative scrollwork. Popular materials included sterling silver, easy to engrave, brass, durable and warm-toned, and gold for those wanting to intimidate in style. Engravings often depicted vines, initials, or geometric motifs to keep the piece looking like conventional jewellery. Public reaction, a mix of delight and concern. When stories spread of rings capable of firing shots, newspapers responded with equal parts fascination and anxiety. Editorials pondered, what if such devices fell into the wrong hands? What if a gentleman gestured too dramatically and fired accidentally? What if a lady's jewellery became the next weapon in a society already full of concealed gadgets? Despite these concerns, revolver rings remained legal in most places. Their tiny ammunition placed them outside many weapons restrictions, and their concealment made them difficult to regulate. Rumours and urban legends. The revolver ring became the source of countless Victorian legends. A pickpocket supposedly fled after a woman's ring fired at point blank. Another tale claimed a man defended himself during a mugging with a ring shot that sent his attacker tumbling backward in shock. Some stories described secret police operatives using ring guns in undercover work, likely exaggerated but widely believed. Victorians adored the idea of miniature mechanisms capable of dramatic outcomes. Whether the stories were true mattered far less than how entertaining they were. Symbolism, power hidden in plain sight. The revolver ring embodied a distinctive Victorian theme, the fusion of elegance and danger. It allowed its wearer to appear refined while remaining quietly armed. It was subtle, surprising and deeply theatrical. For women, it represented empowerment disguised as ornament. For men, it reflected ingenuity and preparedness. For society, it demonstrated the lengths people would go to feel safe in a world growing more chaotic each year. The revolver ring said, I may be small, but I am not defenceless. Victorian life was full of contradictions, but none as theatrical as the deadly fan. A weapon so elegant, so beautifully crafted, and so quietly terrifying that it turned social grace into a defensive art form. On the surface, an ornate folding fan was an accessory meant to flutter delicately during soirees, provide a breeze in crowded ballrooms, or signal coded messages in the elaborate language of fans. But beneath silk, lace, or painted vellum lurked metal ribs, sharpened edges, and concealed knives sharp enough to spoil more than just the evening mood. The good news? You look elegant. The bad news? So does your weapon. Why fans became weapons. In high Victorian society, women were expected to embody gentility, modesty, and poise, even in situations where those expectations left them vulnerable. While men carried canes, concealed derringers, or knuckle dusters, women were often restricted to accessories that maintained decorum. But if the era proved anything, it's that women were extraordinarily creative when protecting themselves within restrictive social norms. Fans were, always carried, socially acceptable in every setting, small and lightweight, and, most importantly, associated entirely with femininity. No one suspected that the delicate flutter of a fan might hide razor-sharp steel. The engineering behind the breeze. A typical deadly fan began as any ornate Victorian fan might. Carved ivory sticks, mother-of-pearl handles, painted silk leaves or lace mounted on bone ribs, but the artisans who turned these into weapons added hidden upgrades, usually invisible unless the fan was fully opened or deliberately activated. Common enhancements included metal ribs disguised as decorative supports, but sharpened along their inner edges. Blade segments concealed within the folds, released by a subtle twist or press. Razor-thin edges embedded along the top arc of the fan, capable of slicing skin with a swipe. Stiletto tips built into the handle, unsheathed with a flick of the wrist. This technology required precision craftsmanship, blending engineering with artistry. Many fan weapons came from the same workshops that produced decorative daggers or miniature mechanical devices. The result was a dual-purpose object, lovely to behold, lethal to mishandle. How women used them. Because fans were both fashion statements and functional weapons, they allowed women to defend themselves without breaking social expectations or their stride. A fan could be snapped shut quickly to deliver a firm, startling jab, swipe outward to deter grabby hands in a crowded street or ballroom, unfold in a single graceful motion that revealed metal ribs glinting under candlelight, conceal a handle spike that discouraged overly persistent admirers. Self-defense manuals of the era rarely acknowledged the existence of deadly fans, but anecdotes circulated that women practiced specific movements, a sharp upward flick for escape maneuvers, or the subtle use of fan edges to create space between themselves and anyone who leaned too close. Some fans even incorporated locking mechanisms, giving the user a rigid structure that could be wielded like a miniature war club. Imagine a woman gently fluttering her fan one moment and blocking an attacker's arm the next, still maintaining perfect posture. Ballrooms, the most unexpected setting for a concealed weapon. It may seem absurd that ballrooms, glittering, refined, crowded with gossip, needed hidden weapons, but Victorian dances often brought together strangers, opportunists and opportunistic strangers. Unwanted touches, cornering attempts, and overconfident suitors happened more often than etiquette guides like to admit. Women could not openly carry defensive tools in these spaces. A sword cane at a formal dance, social death, a pistol, unthinkable, but a fan required. Deadly fans offered a discreet solution, protection woven directly into femininity. Imagine the surprise of a man who thought he was flirting, only to find the edge of a fan lightly pressed against his wrist. Cold, metallic, and instantly clarifying. Travelling women and the fan as companion fans were also popular with women travelling alone or navigating unfamiliar streets. Not every woman could afford a revolver purse or a muff pistol, and not every region permitted the carrying of blade weapons. But a fan, nobody questioned it. Even simpler bladed fans, those with reinforced ribs but not outright knives, were effective deterrents. A quick snap toward the face could shock an attacker long enough for escape. A pointed rib could jab at an arm reaching too close. Reports from travelling diaries, letters, and urban legends describe a women brandishing deadly fans during carriage rides gone suspiciously quiet, dimly lit promenade walks, encounters with strangers who misunderstood politeness for interest. Men had their own versions, sort of though deadly fans were predominantly marketed to women. A few eccentric Victorian men adopted them as well. These models were larger, plainer, and resembled folding batons more than fans. Their existence confirms a profound Victorian truth. If an object existed, someone wanted to weaponize it. The aesthetic of danger. Part of the deadly fan's appeal lay in how perfectly it blended danger with appearance. It represented hidden power beneath delicate beauty, protection encoded in elegance, femininity weaponized discreetly. Victorians loved contradictions, and deadly fans embodied a delicious one. Objects of flirtation turned into objects of defense. Some fans had poems or painted scenes across their surfaces, pastoral landscapes, Cupid motifs, floral garlands. Beneath these charming visuals were metal edges capable of discouraging even the boldest threat. Beauty and danger coexisted seamlessly. Public perception, fascination and denial. Much like revolver rings or weaponized umbrellas, deadly fans occupied a quiet mythic space. People whispered about them more than they openly acknowledged them. Some believed they were real. Others insisted they were exaggerated tales embellished to thrill readers. Victorian newspapers occasionally hinted at defensive fans in crime reports, but they avoided explicit descriptions, perhaps fearing widespread curiosity that only enhanced their legend. Symbolism, the hidden edges of Victorian womanhood. The deadly fan wasn't just a weapon, it symbolized the reality that Victorian society demanded women appear delicate while providing them almost no protection in dangerous environments. Women responded with ingenuity. If society gave them fragile accessories, they found ways to make those accessories sharp. The fan captured a profound truth of the era. Women were expected to flutter, but they learned to slash. Victorian society insisted that women should be delicate, graceful, and incapable of violence. yet simultaneously expected them to navigate cities full of thieves, harassers, and assorted mischief makers. This contradiction inevitably produced one of the era's most fascinating developments: Parasol combat training. Yes, Parasol defense was real, and not only real, it was considered a respectable, even fashionable way for ladies to defend themselves while remaining impeccably polite. Victorian martial arts, a growing trend. By the late 19th century, the urban world had become more dangerous, and women were stepping into public life more frequently. Self-defense manuals exploded in popularity, offering everything from cane fighting to street awareness tips. But women faced a unique challenge. They needed techniques that aligned with social expectations. They couldn't carry obvious weapons, they couldn't kick or strike like men were taught, and they certainly couldn't be seen grappling in the street without risking scandal. So instructors adapted martial arts techniques to the tools women were allowed to carry, especially the parasol. Fashionable, ever-present, and socially acceptable, the parasol became the Victorian woman's best friend, shade provider, and, if needed, enemy discourager. The anatomy of a parasol. Surprisingly perfect for combat. A typical parasol featured a sturdy central shaft, a metal tip, ferrule, reinforced ribs, a curved or carved handle, and a canopy of fabric. What looks delicate was actually a compact structural marvel. The central shaft, often made of whalebone, wood or metal, provided rigidity. The ferrule, meant to rest on the ground, made a perfect striking point. The handle allowed for leverage and rotation. A parasol wasn't a flimsy fashion object. It was a disguised baton waiting to happen. The birth of parasol combat schools. As fears about street crime grew, some self-defense schools began offering classes specifically for women. A few became famous for teaching the refined art of parasol fencing, sometimes referred to as parasol self-defense or umbrella combat. Victorians loved dramatic branding. The classes taught how to block and parry attacks using the parasol's shaft, how to jab with the ferrule to deter assailants, how to strike arms and legs without shattering the parasol, how to use the canopy to disorient or distract, how to step and pivot to maintain balance on uneven cobblestones. Students practiced on padded dummies or with partners using blunt training canes. Newspaper reporters sometimes attended classes for curiosity's sake and left with glowing reviews and occasionally bruises. Signature techniques taught to Victorian women. While each school had its variations, several core parasol techniques became widely known. 1. The forward jab. Simple, sharp, and effective. The lady thrust the ferrule straight ahead, targeting the attacker's abdomen or sternum. It delivered surprising force because of the parasol's length and rigidity. This move was praised for allowing women to keep distance from an assailant. Distance was everything in Victorian garments. 2. The downward strike. With the parasol raised overhead, the user brought it down onto an attacker's arm or wrist. This technique was especially effective against someone trying to grab the parasol, a common instinct for aggressors. 3. The side swipe. A quick horizontal swing, often used to create space or disorient a pursuer. Instructors advise striking the upper arm or ribs, areas likely to buckle rather than cause fatal injury, which would create legal complications and definitely ruin the social calendar. 4. The parry and pivot. Borrowed from fencing, this move trained women to deflect an incoming grab or strike with the parasol's shaft, then pivot away. It turned the parasol into a shielding tool, allowing a graceful retreat that maintained both safety and dignity. 5. The cloak and shade maneuver. Unique to parasols, this involved flipping open the canopy to momentarily blind or confuse an assailant. While the attacker reacted to the sudden burst of fabric, the defender used the moment to escape or reposition. This technique was most effective in daylight, where the sudden shadow played visual tricks, less so at night, where it mostly caused mild confusion. The social acceptability of parasol combat. Unlike knives or pistols, Parasols had the advantage of appearing harmless. A lady carrying one did not convey menace, only fashion and preparedness for unpredictable weather. This gave women remarkable freedom. Even the most conservative social circles found it acceptable for ladies to attend parasol defence classes, especially after newspapers published cautionary tales about evening crimes or attacks in crowded railway stations. Etiquette guides even addressed parasol use in emergencies. One particularly prim manual advised, "A lady may employ her parasol to deter the uncouth, provided she refrains from causing undue injury," which was Victorian code for "do what you must, dear, but don't leave a scandalous mess." Parasol combat demonstrations. Public exhibitions occasionally showcased parasol defence techniques. These displays drew large crowds and blended martial instruction with theatrical flair. Women demonstrated coordinated parries, defensive footwork, choreographed attacks on masked assistants. These events helped normalise the idea of women learning self-defence, within the bounds of propriety, of course. The dual identity of the parasol. The parasol's strength as a weapon lay in its dual identity. It was feminine but formidable, delicate but durable, fashionable but functional. This mirrored the contradictory expectations placed on Victorian women, to appear gentle yet remain vigilant, to navigate society gracefully, while knowing danger lurked in shadowed alleyways and crowded markets. Symbolism, agency in the guise of elegance. Parasol combat gave women more than safety. It offered reassurance, autonomy, confidence in public spaces, and a quiet defiance against societal limits. It allowed women to defend themselves without adopting masculine-coded weapons or tactics. Instead, they transformed a symbol of femininity into a declaration of capability. In the end, a weapon, hidden in plain sight. Parasol defence stands as one of the most extraordinary examples of Victorian creativity in adapting everyday objects for survival. It wasn't a gadget. It wasn't a hidden blade or disguised firearm. It was an art form built around the tools women already possessed, and the courage they already carried. Victorians adored elaborate self-defence gadgets, sword canes, revolver rings, parasol manoeuvres worthy of stage combat. But sometimes the simplest weapon was also the most effective. Throw something painful directly into the attacker's eyes and run like your corset isn't laced too tightly. Thus emerged one of the most unglamorous yet surprisingly popular tools in personal protection, Victorian pocket sand, though the sand in question often came in far spicier varieties. While the name lacks elegance, the concept was disarmingly straightforward. Carry a small container, something discreet, something ordinary, and fill it with pepper, ash, dust, or any irritant capable of temporarily disabling a wrongdoer. One quick flick of the wrist and your attacker went from confident to confused, from menacing to momentarily blind. Self-defense meets playground strategy, Victorian edition. Why something so simple caught on? Victorian cities were crowded, chaotic, poorly lit, and full of characters whose intentions varied wildly. Not everyone could afford a concealed revolver or weaponized parasol. Not everyone wanted to rely on mechanical alarms. Sometimes self-defense needed to be cheap, easy to use, and not dependent on engineering that might jam at the worst possible moment. Enter irritant powders, the universal equalizer. Women, children, working-class men, elderly pedestrians, anyone could carry a pinch of trouble in their pockets. And best of all, you didn't need strength, you didn't need training, you didn't need aim worthy of a rifleman. You just needed to get close enough to fling something inconvenient directly into an aggressor's face. What exactly was in Victorian pocket sand? Victorian pocket irritants varied widely depending on budget, creativity, and access to household supplies. Common ingredients included finely ground black pepper, the classic choice, red pepper, flakes or cayenne powder, for those who believed in maximum suffering, tobacco dust, which produced coughing fits in seconds, ash or soot easily gathered from fireplaces and chimneys, lime powder used occasionally but dangerously, effective, yes, but capable of serious injury, making it controversial even then. But one of the most widely used mixtures was something called devil's pepper, a blend of pepper and other irritants sold discreetly in small paper packets at markets. Vendors never labelled it as a weapon, but when asked directly, they gave knowing smiles and said it was for household needs. The containers innocent-looking, yet strategic, carrying loose powder in pockets was impractical. Victorians already battled lint, crumbs and questionable objects lost to the depths of coat linings, so small containers became essential. Popular choices included miniature tins similar to snuff boxes, hinged lockets worn around the neck for quick access, tiny glass vials disguised as perfume samples, wooden matchbooks repurposed as powder holders, thistle-down pouches, lightweight and quick to open. Each container had its advantages. Metal tins opened fast, lockets were easily reached. Glass vials shattered dramatically, not ideal but undeniably effective. Matchbooks flicked open with a satisfying snap. Skies mattered too. Respectable Victorians didn't want to appear paranoid. A pepper tin labelled confection was much less alarming to passers-by than one labelled temporary blindness powder. How pocket sand was used. The technique was unapologetically simple. There were only 3 rules, repeated in newspapers, pamphlets, and whispered advice. Don't hesitate. Waiting until an attacker grabbed you meant losing the advantage. Aim for the face. The eyes, nose, and mouth were prime real estate for maximum chaos. Run immediately. Pocket sand was not meant to start a fight. It was designed to end one, briefly so escape became possible. Women often practiced flicking motions at home, sometimes using flour for safety, which surely led to some of the strangest housekeeping scenes ever witnessed. Why it worked so well. The brilliance of pocket irritants lay in their ability to overwhelm the senses instantly. Eyes burned and watered, noses stung, breathing hitched or stopped, visibility dropped to nothing, confidence evaporated. Attackers were not expecting a Victorian lady, clerk or errand boy to respond with a face full of spice. Surprise alone often ended the encounter. And in an era of heavy skirts, stiff boots and a limited mobility, disabling the attacker, not outrunning him, was the safest path to escape. Social reactions, quiet approval, loud complaints. Pocket sand straddled the line between propriety and pragmatism. Women supported it because it gave them agency without violating dress codes or social norms. Working-class men approved because it didn't require firearms licenses or training. Police tolerated it because although irritant powders were annoying to clean from uniforms, they were far preferable to knives or pistols. Criminals despised it, which was precisely the point. Predictably, a few critics emerged. Some moral commentators argued that irritant powders were unwomanly, as if self-defense somehow undermined femininity. Others claimed the powders might encourage reckless boldness, suggesting that knowing how to protect oneself might incite bad behaviour. Victorians were nothing if not imaginative in their judgment. Still, the practical benefits far outweighed the hand-wringing. Pocket sand in popular culture and urban myths. Newspapers occasionally reported dramatic escapes. A flower seller who flung pepper into a thief's eyes, causing him to stumble into a fruit cart. A governess who scattered ash at a pursuer and vanished into a crowd. A young clerk who used tobacco dust to break free from 2 men attempting to snatch a cash satchel. Were these stories embellished? Absolutely, but they served an important role, convincing the public that inexpensive, humble tools could be surprisingly powerful. Pocket sand became a symbol of everyday resilience. Why it endured: the democratization of self-defense. Victorian self-defense often skewed toward the wealthy. Weaponized umbrellas, custom fans, engraved cane swords, but pocket irritants required no manufacturing and no money. They represented self-reliance accessible to everyone. In a society with rigid gender roles, strict propriety, and limited mobility for many groups, pocket sand was a tiny pocket revolution. It said, "You may not let me carry a sword, but you certainly can't stop me from carrying pepper." Victorian fashion is often remembered for tight corsets, layered skirts, and hats so large they could alter local weather patterns. But beneath those respectable silhouettes lurked something far more daring: weaponized footwear. Yes, Victorian women sometimes walked the streets wearing boots that held slim blades, reinforced heels, or hidden metal tips, capable of delivering a surprisingly persuasive kick. Fashionably dangerous wasn't just a witty description, it was an entire product category. Why boots became weapons Victorian? Women spent much of their time on foot, running errands, visiting markets, going to work, or commuting along dim streets with questionable lighting. Gloves could hide rings, purses could hide pistols, muffs could hide revolvers. But what about those moments when a woman's hands were full, or when discreet action mattered more than dramatic gadgetry? The answer was elegantly simple: turn footwear into armour. Boots were always present, always accessible, and always within striking range. And because Victorian women's boots came high up the ankle and laced tightly, manufacturers had plenty of material to modify discreetly. Moreover, footwear was one of the few items women could rely on fully. It wouldn't fall out of a bag, require cocking, or need a safety mechanism. If danger approached, your feet were already armed and ready. Hidden blades, when walking became tactical. One of the most striking innovations was the slim blade concealed inside the boot shaft. The blade rested snugly along the outer side of the ankle, accessible through a narrow slit between the leather layers. To draw it, the wearer simply reached down, tugged a small tab, and revealed a thin stiletto-style knife. These knives were lightweight, narrow enough to avoid detection, sharp enough to break skin or cut rope, and long enough to discourage an attacker with immediate enthusiasm. Blade boots appealed to women who needed a defensive tool but wanted something quieter than firearms, and more permanent than handheld gadgets. A blade hidden in footwear was always available. No fumbling through bags or pockets. Some versions even featured magnetized sheaths that held the blade securely during daily movement, preventing the horrifying possibility of accidentally stabbing oneself while tying the laces. Reinforced heels, because sometimes a kick is a statement. Not all women wanted to wield blades. Many opted for reinforced heels, which turned ordinary kicks into structurally assisted warnings. Heel reinforcements involved steel inserts hidden inside the heel block, metal plates layered under the boot leather, or hardened rubber moulded to deliver extra impact. Some boots featured metal heel caps engraved with floral designs, because Victorians had to make everything look charming, even the parts designed for self-defense. These boots allowed their wearers to stomp on an attacker's foot with bone-jarring efficiency, deliver backward kicks without losing balance, and defend themselves during close-quarters struggles when movement was restricted by corsets or the layers of skirts. A well-placed heel to the shin, ankle, or instep delivered a rude awakening. Toe caps, subtle but serious. Another innovation was the hardened toe cap hidden beneath polished leather. These gave additional force to forward kicks and protected the wearer's toes from injury during confrontations. Unlike steel-toed boots of later centuries, Victorian toe caps were slim and elegant, designed to maintain the graceful silhouette of ladies' footwear. They were a marriage of aesthetic restraint and purposeful reinforcement. A lady might look delicate while stepping off a carriage, but her boots whispered, "Try something foolish and learn from your mistakes." Who wore stiletto-style boots? Weaponized boots were particularly popular among working women, factory workers, shop girls and domestic servants often walked home late and alone. Regular boots wore down quickly, so having reinforced versions made practical and defensive sense. Theatre performers and dancers. Women who left venues after dark wanted security without relying on escorts. Their boots became part of their survival kit. Travellers women taking long-distance trains or omnibuses favoured boots with hidden tools for journeys into unfamiliar towns. Fashion-forward rebels. Some women embraced these boots simply because they delighted in the idea of hiding danger beneath satin bows. Manufacturers lean into the trend. By the 1880s, catalogues quietly offered reinforced ladies' boots for city walking, safety toe footwear, or ankle blades for emergencies. No advertisement outright stated, "Ladies, here are your stabbing shoes," but the messaging was clear enough. Craftsmen took pride in blending subtle engineering into delicate work. Some boots featured decorative buttons hiding blade release tabs, embroidered seams concealing reinforcement panels, ornate boot pulls that functioned as emergency blade grips. This subtlety made them highly desirable. Nothing about them violated Victorian fashion, yet everything about them challenged Victorian vulnerability. The cultural reaction: discreet, slightly alarmed, and mostly impressed. Unlike more conspicuous weapons, boots attracted little controversy. After all, who would check a woman's footwear for hidden blades? Criticism existed, mainly from commentators who believed women should rely on chaperones, not craftsmanship. But boots escaped the level of scrutiny aimed at hatpins or revolvers. Police rarely addressed them since boots were not openly carried. They technically contained tools rather than weapons, and they caused fewer public accidents. No one accidentally pepper-sprayed or shot themselves with their footwear. As a result, boots remained one of the more quietly successful self-defense trends of the era. The psychology of walking. Armed, weaponized boots granted women something profound: confidence. Walking alone at night is different when your very steps are fortified. These boots allowed Victorian women to reclaim psychological territory denied to them by social expectations and unsafe streets. A blade boot whispered, "You may underestimate me, but you shouldn't." A reinforced heel declared, "I will not be cornered." And yet the boots maintained the guise of perfect respectability, proof that Victorian ingenuity thrived under the pressure of social constraints. In the end, power at every step. Stiletto-style boots were not about fashion rebellion or martial theatrics. They were about survival disguised as style. They offered protection that required no training, no dramatic reveals, no reputational risk. Just step, kick, stab if necessary, and keep walking. Victorians loved accessories. They also loved gadgets, and they really loved the idea of preparing for danger while maintaining an air of absolute dignity. Combine those three passions and you get one of the strangest, most theatrical self-defense innovations of the era. The gentleman's multi-purpose belt. A waist-worn contraption hiding knives, tools, clubs, and occasionally firearms. Think Batman, but with mutton chops and questionable tailoring decisions. Why belts became Victorian. Utility gear men of the era had limited ways to carry weapons discreetly. A visible pistol drew suspicion. A cane sword suggested you were trying too hard. Brass knuckles were frowned upon in polite company. But belts? Belts were utterly ordinary. Every man wore one, or at least some form of waist support, even if Victorian trouser technology occasionally rendered them decorative rather than essential. Belts offered constant accessibility, concealment under jackets or waistcoats, room for compartments, pockets and holsters, and the ability to hide tools in a way that would confuse even the nosiest observer. Thus, the multi-purpose belt evolved from a simple strap of leather into a privately maintained survival kit for the anxious urban gentleman. Knives hidden in plain sight. The most common upgrade was the belt knife. Unlike traditional sheaths worn on the hip, these knives were integrated into the belt itself. Some slid into narrow stitched channels, some were hidden behind decorative plates. A few folded like early pocket knives and snapped into discreet slots. The knives were typically small, 2 to 4 inches long, but sharp enough to deter attackers or cut through bindings. Gentlemen who travelled by train or foot often preferred these models. They could be drawn with a subtle tug, concealed smoothly afterward, and used without broadcasting aggression. Blunt tools for defensive strikes. Not every man wanted blades. Some opted for blunt instruments concealed in the belt's lining. These included weighted rods that slid out like rigid rulers of discipline, small clubs housed in hollow belt cavities, or compact batons that unfolded from flat segments. These tools were designed for quick jabs, wrist strikes, or breaking the grip of assailants. Their biggest advantage was durability. No moving parts, no risk of snapping, just raw leather-wrapped physics. Manufacturers diplomatically described them as travel aids, night walkers, or street companions, avoiding the phrase, "please do not strike people with this," because that would defeat the marketing purpose. Tiny pistols, the belt's most ambitious secret for gentlemen who found knives and blunt tools too subtle, some belts hid micro-pistols integrated into cleverly disguised holsters. These were not full-size firearms, but miniature derringer-like weapons with single or double barrels, small percussion caps or pinfire cartridges, minimal recoil most of the time, and almost non-existent accuracy. Still, they packed enough punch to discourage attackers, especially when fired at close range from an unexpected angle. The wearer simply slipped a hand under his waistcoat, unlatched a flap, and drew the pistol with a motion so quick it surprised even seasoned street thieves. These belts appealed to men with dramatic tendencies, the types who secretly hoped danger might arrive just so they could perform a flourish. Tools beyond weapons, a belt for all occasions. Victorians loved multifunction devices, and the multi-purpose belt often included tools for general survival. Lockpicks hidden behind buckle plates, collapsible corkscrews, danger comes in many forms, miniature telescopes, flint and steel for fire starting, and even tiny compartments for emergency coins. These additions made the belt not only a self-defense item but a Swiss Army gadget long before such a thing became mainstream. A typical advertisement boasted, "prepared for travel, for emergencies, and for the unexpected." The unexpected, in Victorian language, usually meant someone attempting to mug you in the fog while pretending to ask for directions. Engineering marvels of Victorian leatherwork. Creating a belt with this much functionality required exceptional craftsmanship. Leatherworkers collaborated with metalworkers, gunsmiths, and toolmakers to create belts that were sturdy enough to hold concealed weapons, flexible enough for daily wear, and discreet enough to pass for ordinary clothing. Some belts featured reinforced stitching capable of resisting tension even when packed with gear. Others included pivoting sections or concealed hinges, turning the belt into a kind of wearable puzzle box. One high-end version included a buckle that doubled as a brass knuckle, because why not add more chaos to an already ambitious accessory? Who bought these belts? The target audience was broad: travelling businessmen carrying cash or documents, clerks walking late from railway stations, gentlemen living in rougher parts of the city, adventurers and explorers, because nothing says prepared like a waistful of tools, men aspiring to mysterious heroic personas, even if they mainly use the belt for cutting string and opening parcels. Middle-class buyers especially valued the belts. They offered security without the cost of elaborate cane weapons or custom revolvers. Public perception, mostly ignorant, mildly alarmed. When not unlike hatpins or brass knuckles, belt weapons rarely caused controversy. They were hidden beneath layers of clothing, rarely displayed, and seldom mentioned publicly. Most people had no idea these belts existed unless they saw one in action, or read about them in sensational advertisements tucked in the back pages of newspapers. Even police generally adored them unless used recklessly. The belt was an invisible weapon, and Victorian law enforcement had neither the time nor inclination to examine every gentleman's waistline. Symbolism, the private arsenal of the polished man. The multi-purpose belt represented the Victorian man's desire to embody confidence, capability, and independence. While outwardly composed and refined, he carried tools that revealed an unspoken truth. Victorian urban life demanded readiness. The belt symbolized preparedness not only for violence but for everyday unpredictability. Broken coach straps, unexpected detours, mechanical failures, and yes, criminals lurking where gas lamps flickered weakest. It encapsulated a dual nature: civility wrapped around survival instincts, fashion hiding function, elegance concealing edginess. In the end, Batman wasn't the first long before comic book heroes stuffed gadgets into utility belts. Victorian gentlemen quietly walked around with their own early prototypes, less polished, more leather-smelling, but equally dramatic. These belts blended practicality with bravado, subtlety with extravagance, and fear with inventiveness. They embodied a world where danger was never far, but where Victorian creativity was always ready to meet it. Victorian society adored the idea of the home as a sanctuary. Quiet, orderly, morally sealed from the chaos of the streets. But in practice, homes were vulnerable, doors were thin, windows often rattled in their frames, and the average lock provided all the resistance of a determined toddler. Women left alone in houses, whether servants watching over townhomes, widows living independently, or wives whose husbands travelled frequently, faced particular risk. Thus emerged a burgeoning market of home defence gadgets, all marketed with the Victorian equivalent of late-night infomercial enthusiasm. These tools were clever, mechanical, dramatic, and often mildly ridiculous. They promised safety in a world where the police might arrive too late, and where a burglar could slip in quietly through a poorly latched window. This was home security, Victorian style, a mixture of engineering ingenuity, social anxiety, and just enough theatricality to make even burglars pause. The spiked window wedge, the first line of defence. Burglars loved windows. They were easy to pry up, poorly reinforced, and numerous. So Victorian inventors worked to make them less inviting. Enter the spiked window wedge. This device was deceptively simple. A carved wooden or metal wedge fitted with sharp spikes, which the homeowner jammed into the track of a window sash. If anyone attempted to lift the window from the outside, it snagged on the spikes, producing either excruciating difficulty, significant noise, or both. Some wedges were fitted with spring tension so that if the burglar forced the window upward, the spikes would snap downward into the sash, digging deeper and alerting the homeowner. Women were encouraged to set these wedges every evening, especially on ground floor windows. Instructional booklets suggested doing so with ceremony. A careful woman fortifies her home with prudence as a knight fortifies his castle. Because if a wedge full of nails doesn't protect your home, at least a dramatic metaphor might. The bedside bludgeon, the only sleep aid you would actually swing next, came one of the most notorious Victorian home defence items, the bedside bludgeon. This was a short, heavy striking tool kept discreetly next to the bed, often disguised as a curtain rod, a fire poker, a decorative cane, or even a wooden rolling pin. The bludgeon's purpose was spectacularly straightforward. If a stranger entered the bedroom with ill intent, the woman should swing first and explain later. Cheap, reliable, and brutally effective, the bedside bludgeon gained popularity among all classes. Wealthy households kept them as ornamental canes beside four-poster beds. Working-class women kept them under thin mattresses or tucked behind wash basins. Even governesses in lonely estate wings reportedly slept with them within reach. Many designs incorporated subtle enhancements, weighted cores for extra momentum, leather-wrapped grips to prevent slipping, ridged or faceted heads to maximize pain and minimize effort. Manufacturers were too polite to call them weapons. Instead, they used phrases like night companion, domestic protector, or the refined euphemism, an implement of reassurance. But everyone knew exactly what they were for. Spring-loaded door alarms, noise as a shield. Not every homeowner wanted confrontation. Some preferred to let mechanical contraptions scream on their behalf. That's where Victorian spring-loaded door alarms came into play. These devices attached to the inside of the main door or bedroom door. When someone attempted to open it, a spring snapped, a gear spun, and a small but incredibly shrill bell activated. Other models used whistles or metal ratchets, producing a sound like a distressed violin. The point wasn't elegance, the point was volume. These alarms served several purposes. They startled intruders, they alerted neighbours, they woke sleeping residents. They bought valuable seconds for escape or preparation. Women living alone were among the primary buyers. They couldn't rely on dogs or servants at all hours. and calling out for help was unreliable in homes with heavy drapes and thick walls. Some advanced models even incorporated double triggers, a bell inside the house and one outside, to shame intruders publicly. Nothing ends a burglary faster than being loudly advertised. Metal door bars, reinforcing the Victorian threshold. Another popular tool was the metal security bar, a heavy rod placed against the door at an angle, braced against the floor. If someone attempted to push inward, the bar leveraged the entire weight of the floorboards against the effort. Even moderately strong intruders found themselves thwarted by physics, leverage, and Victorian stubbornness. These bars were simple, affordable, and effective. Women praised them in personal letters and household advice columns, calling them the housekeeper's best guarantee of restful sleep. Some bars included decorative finials so they could sit in a corner by day without appearing unsightly, because nothing says civilized home like hiding your burglar-proof battering rod behind a potted fern. Portable panic tools. For when the noise needed to be immediate beyond static defences, women kept small handheld tools for sudden threats, handbells for summoning neighbours or servants, pocket whistles designed for indoor echoes, pepper spray tubes, powder-based of course, kept in bedside drawers. These small items complemented the larger defensive infrastructure, creating a layered system of Victorian home security. Modern security companies call this multi-tiered defence. Victorians called it not wanting to die before breakfast. Women as defensive strategists. Contrary to stereotypes, Victorian women became skilled at planning their homes' nighttime safety. Magazines published advice on where to place alarms, how to set wedges, which doors required reinforcement, and how to move silently in the event of intrusion. Women living alone were encouraged to rehearse their emergency steps. They were in essence their own alarm systems, supported by gadgets that amplified their readiness. One popular piece of advice read, "A woman alone must not reside in fear, but in preparedness." It was empowerment in a world that rarely acknowledged female agency. Symbolism, turning the home into a fortress. Home defense tools were more than physical objects. They represented anxiety about crime, the fragility of privacy, and the growing independence of Victorian women. These devices allowed women to reclaim a sense of control in an era when they were often told their only protection should come from men. Victorian home security did not promise absolute safety, but it provided women with the tools and the confidence to meet danger on their own terms. If you picture Victorian England as a polite world of top hats, corsets, and rigid etiquette, you're only half right. The other half of the era was obsessed with getting punched in the face and learning how to avoid it. Thus emerged an unexpected publishing boom. Self-defense manuals, richly illustrated, earnestly written, and unintentionally hilarious in their attempts to teach proper violence with impeccable manners. Books like Baritsu, The New Art of Self-Defense, and Defensive Gymnastics for Gentlemen lined bookstore shelves, offering techniques for city survival that ranged from practical to delightfully optimistic. In an age where fog hid danger, crime felt unpredictable, and respectable citizens feared being caught unprepared, these manuals provided something truly Victorian, the promise of safety through carefully choreographed civility. Why martial arts manuals exploded in popularity. By the mid-19th century, rapid urbanization brought crowds, confusion, and rising anxiety. Crime reports sensationalized attacks on well-dressed pedestrians. Punch magazines poked fun at city ruffians. Penny dreadfuls featured ambushes, muggings, and alleyway brawls. Citizens wanted to feel prepared, but without appearing brutish. Public brawling was frowned upon. Carrying obvious weapons was often illegal or socially inappropriate. But learning dignified self-defense, that was respectable, even fashionable. So manuals promised exactly that. Protection wrapped in refinement, physical skill delivered with Victorian poise. Baritsu, the most famous martial art Victorians didn't actually invent, but claimed they did. The term Baritsu appears famously in the Sherlock Holmes story, The Adventure of the Empty House, where Holmes credits it for surviving his confrontation with Moriarty. In reality, baritsu was a misspelling or deliberate stylization of bartitsu, a hybrid martial art created by Edward William Barton Wright in the 1890s. Bartitsu combined jujutsu, boxing, cane fighting, savate or French kickboxing, and wrestling techniques. It was the Victorian version of mixed martial arts, but with more waistcoats. Barton Wright opened a martial arts academy boasting padded rooms, specialised instructors, and demonstrations where moustached gentlemen politely threw each other across the mat. The art emphasised leverage, balance, and cunning rather than brute force, ideal for the middle-class clerk or gentleman who wanted to learn self-defence without breaking a sweat or a monocle. Bartitsu manuals illustrated moves such as throwing the ruffian over the shoulder, the gentle twist of escape, and disabling a thug using only one's walking stick. The drawings showed well-groomed men restraining attackers who looked suspiciously like slightly dishevelled accountants. The new art of self-defence, boxing with manners, earlier manuals such as the New Art of Self-Defence published in the early 1800s focused largely on boxing, but presented it as a gentlemanly pursuit. This book attempted to civilise fisticuffs by teaching correct stances, approved punching angles, and proper footwork for urban encounters. The illustrations featured men in tidy breeches delivering crisp blows, as if engaged in a spirited debate with their fists. Every punch looked strangely polite, as though the gentlemen were apologising mid-strike. These manuals emphasised physical conditioning and awareness, but maintained Victorian values. Keep your posture straight, keep your temper cooler than your tea, and if you must hit someone, do it cleanly. Defensive gymnastics. Violence, but make it educational. By the 1850s and 1860s, gymnastics became popular, and with it came odd hybrid manuals teaching defensive gymnastics, essentially choreographed combat mixed with calisthenics. These guides encouraged men to develop strength, agility, and the ability to vault over obstacles while looking heroic. Exercises included rolling escapes, controlled falls, and methods for slipping out of holds. Many seemed designed for theatrical flair rather than real-life danger. Still, they instilled confidence, and confidence was half the battle, especially for men trained never to appear unsettled. The illustrations. Victorian combat, immaculately drawn. No discussion of these manuals is complete without addressing the artwork. Most illustrations depicted gentlemen wearing full suits, complete with waistcoats, collars, and occasionally hats, which they never seemed to lose mid-fight. These drawings showcased perfect hair, symmetrical movements, faintly bewildered expressions on the attackers, and instructional arrows pointing towards the proper direction in which to throw your opponent, who looked as though he regretted volunteering. Sometimes the attacker was labelled simply as the ruffian. He often wore striped trousers and a scowl, making him the Victorian equivalent of a video game enemy NPC. Readers adored these illustrations. They turned violence into choreography and danger into diagram. Why manuals targeted middle-class men? The manuals aimed at a very specific market, respectable men who wanted self-defence without compromising dignity. Middle-class readers bought these books because they feared urban crime. They lacked access to private instructors. They wanted to defend themselves without carrying socially frowned-upon weapons. They enjoyed the novelty of Victorian combat science. Self-defence became part of the broader culture of self-improvement. If you could learn French, penmanship, and the violin, why not add defeating burglars in 3 elegant steps? Women's manuals, rare but real. A smaller category of manuals targeted women, teaching escapes from grabs, shawl pin strikes, parasol techniques, and foot positioning designed for skirts. These guides were less common but increasingly in demand as women moved through cities more independently. They avoided overt aggression, instead framing techniques as discouragements or dissuasion by leverage. Victorians were allergic to calling anything what it actually was. The promise, survival through knowledge, manuals assured readers that intelligence and preparation could overcome brute force. They taught how to break holds, how to remain balanced on slippery cobblestones, how to use everyday objects as shields or leverage points, how to mentally manage panic, and how to walk with an air of confidence that discouraged would-be attackers. Victorians believed criminals targeted those who looked frightened. Therefore, simply reading a manual, even if one never mastered the moves, could psychologically fortify the timid. Symbolism, knowledge as armour. Self-defense manuals weren't just about martial techniques, they symbolised the Victorian belief in self-reliance, moral fortitude and intellectual mastery over chaos. These books offered reassurance that danger could be met with discipline, not desperation, with principles, not panic. And if one happened to learn how to flip a ruffian over a shoulder while maintaining good posture, all the better. Victorian self-defense culture did not grow in a vacuum. It grew in an atmosphere of public fear, newspaper sensationalism and relentless marketing that insisted the streets were so dangerous you might not survive your afternoon stroll unless you purchased a gadget with gears, bells, spikes, or a discreet blade hidden somewhere unlikely. And if fear alone didn't sell it, advertisements stepped in with their uniquely Victorian blend of eloquence and alarmism. Buy this cane sword or perish instantly next Tuesday. Not an actual quote, but spiritually, absolutely accurate. To understand why self-defense tools flourished, one must understand the marketing ecosystem that fed them. This chapter explores that ecosystem. The police endorsements that lent legitimacy, the public anxieties that stoked demand, and the entrepreneurs who crafted irresistible narratives of fear and salvation. Police endorsements, when law enforcement became unintentional influencers. Victorian police forces walked a tightrope between calming the public and acknowledging their own limitations. Officers were overworked, patrol routes sparse, and communication systems primitive. By the time a constable arrived at the scene of a crime, the criminal was often long gone, along with whatever valuables had motivated the incident. To compensate, police sometimes encouraged citizens to take reasonable precautions, which gadget makers immediately translated as officer approved, it's a mandatory for survival. It didn't matter that the constable merely said, best keep alert at night. Within a week, advertisements proclaimed, recommended by police for gentlemen walking after dark. Some companies sent samples directly to police stations, hoping for endorsements. Officers might casually remark that a device seemed solidly built. That lukewarm comment quickly inflated into brochure-worthy praise. One cane manufacturer proudly announced, approved by Senior Constabulary for defensive potential. Translation: someone in a uniform once nodded politely at it, yet these pseudo-endorsements worked. If the police, symbols of order and authority, appeared to support a gadget, anxious Victorians flocked to buy it. Public fears, a city of shadows and suspicion. Marketing succeeded because the Victorian public was already primed with fear. Urbanisation brought swelling populations, cramped alleys and gaslit nights thick with fog. People couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Footsteps emerged from nowhere. Policemen's whistles echoed ominously. Newspapers printed melodramatic stories of street villains and brazen footpads, making every shadow feel conspiratorial. Much of this fear was exaggerated, but in a city where wages were low, poverty was visible, and policing inconsistent, citizens felt exposed. Self-defense gadgets represented insurance, physical security bought in small, tangible pieces, and fear once stirred is a potent motivator. Advertising genius, selling terror, with a polite smile. Victorian advertisements were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. They blended flowery language with dramatic warnings, creating a perfect cocktail of anxiety and aspiration. A typical ad might read, "The modern gentleman must move confidently through the night. Should he encounter those who wish him harm, let him be ready with this improved protector of impeccable design." Translated, buy this gadget or the fog will eat you. Ad creators understood their audience. They played on fear of unknown assailants, fear of appearing unprepared, and fear of losing dignity more than losing property. Victorians dreaded embarrassment nearly as much as injury. The idea of being mugged without resistance felt socially humiliating. Gadget sellers capitalized on this, implying that ownership was a moral duty. Some ads even hinted that failing to purchase protection wasn't just foolish, it was irresponsible. A prudent man guards his life as carefully as his honor. The subtext: don't be the only idiot walking around without a pocket bludgeon. Inventors who promised too much. Victorian gadget makers were ambitious, sometimes too ambitious. Their devices promised capabilities bordering on magical. Cane swords that could deter any assailant while remaining light as a feather. Noisemaker alarms that purportedly could summon aid from blocks away. They could not. Weighted gloves marketed as the safest method for disabling a ruffian without risk to oneself. Pocket pistols described as sufficient to repel multiple attackers with ease. Many gadgets worked in theory but fell short in practice. That did not stop marketers from presenting them as essential tools for every citizen, from merchants to milkmen. One famous advertisement claimed, "Why fear the night when you may carry the defences of day within your coat?" Another dramatic pamphlet warned, "Criminals choose victims who appear defenceless. Do not be counted among them." In essence, Victorian advertising took the form of a constant gentle threat. The psychology of gadgets, owning security. Buying a self-defense device wasn't just about protection, it provided reassurance, control, the illusion of preparedness, and a sense of empowerment in unpredictable environments. Even if the buyer never used the gadget, the act of owning it reduced anxiety. This emotional comfort kept the market thriving, regardless of the gadget's actual effectiveness. Owning a device also allowed Victorians to imagine themselves capable. In a society that prized self-discipline, the idea of being prepared, even privately, was deeply satisfying. Newspapers, fearmongering's favourite ally. Newspapers amplified every unusual incident. Muggings in fog, burglaries through unlocked windows, dramatic accounts of lone women confronting prowlers, stories of escaped convicts crisscrossing London's slums. Sometimes these stories were true, sometimes they were embellished. Sometimes they were written with the express knowledge that advertisers would then buy space directly beside them. Imagine reading, "A frightening attack on a Strand pedestrian last night," followed immediately by, "Protect yourself with the improved Norwich Guardian cane." Coincidence? Absolutely not. Police responses to the gadget craze. Privately, many officers were sceptical of gadget mania. They worried that civilians might misuse weapons or escalate situations unnecessarily. Yet they also recognised that the tools made people feel safer and that public confidence mattered. As long as gadgets didn't cause injuries to bystanders, a problem occasionally noted with alarm horns, bludgeons and pepper powders, police mostly tolerated them. Still, one constable famously remarked, "The city sells more fear than bread these days," an astute observation of Victorian capitalism. Symbolism, selling safety by selling fear. Self-defense gadget marketing revealed a culture caught between progress and panic. Victorians were modernizing, embracing industry, science and new freedoms, but also living with unprecedented urban anxieties. In essence, the gadgets themselves were not the product, the feeling of safety was. Manufacturers understood this intimately. They promised not just protection, but peace of mind so long as customers kept buying. As Victorian self-defense culture flourished, with umbrellas hiding blades, boots hiding knives, belts hiding everything short of a small marching band, public unease inevitably followed. What began as a practical response to urban danger slowly spiraled into a national conversation filled with moral hand-wringing, newspaper outrage, political debate, and one unforgettable scandal involving hatpins so long they could theoretically skewer a small horse. Self-defense tools had become widespread, inventive, and increasingly conspicuous, and whenever a society invents something clever, another part of it immediately panics. Thus emerged the era's great controversies: safety laws to rein in dangerous accessories, fears about overarmed citizens, and heated debates over whether personal protection was empowering or evidence of creeping chaos. At the centre of it all stood a surprising villain: the humble hatpin hysteria, when women's fashion terrified the public. By the early 20th century, the tail end of the Victorian and Edwardian mindset, women's hats grew larger, heavier, and anchored to their hair, with hatpins up to 12 inches long. These slender metal spikes kept hats from flying off in wind, carriages, or moments when women were required to faint dramatically. But soon, women realised something. Hatpins made excellent weapons. Newspapers published stories, some true, many embellished, about women fending off assailants with lightning-fast hatpin thrusts. Headlines proclaimed, "Woman saves herself with hatpin. Highwayman routed by ladies' millinery." Suddenly society panicked. Men began complaining that women were armed to the teeth. Politicians fretted that public transportation was becoming dangerous, not from criminals, but from a sea of stylish ladies wielding accidental spears. Cartoonists depicted women as porcupines bristling with deadly spikes. What truly terrified critics was not the hatpin itself, but what it symbolised: women defending themselves without permission. The push for hatpin regulations. Cities from London to Sydney to Chicago began proposing hatpin safety laws. Some called for shorter pins, others demanded bead-covered tips, still others wanted outright bans unless the woman could prove a special need. Because nothing says sensible legislation like requiring paperwork to wear a hat. One London alderman famously declared, "A woman should not walk the streets armed for warfare." Women responded with the Victorian equivalent of "try me." Working-class women argued that hatpins were their only effective defence in crowded streets. Factory workers and shopgirls often walked home alone at night. Removing their hatpins meant removing their security. Middle-class women saw regulation as an insult to their autonomy. Suffragettes, aware that society already feared their political energy, turned hatpin debates into a symbol of female power. They insisted they had every right to defend themselves with the tools available. In one parliamentary hearing, a witness reportedly said, "If men fear the hatpins so much, perhaps they should behave better." The moral panic did not quiet down after that. Weapon licensing, when gadgets outpaced laws beyond hatpins, other Victorian self-defense tools raised legal eyebrows. Legislators struggled to keep up with inventions like sword canes, muff pistols, concealed daggers, miniature firearms disguised as jewellery walking sticks that shot bullets, gas, or weighted projectiles. The legal system asked, at what point does a fashionable accessory become a weapon? But Victorians loved loopholes. Gadget makers simply adjusted their designs until they no longer fit a banned category. If authorities banned hidden pistols, they made detachable ones. If they banned detachable ones, they disguised them as tools for gardening, travel, or household necessity. Criminal courts became battlegrounds for semantics. This is not a dagger, Your Honour, but a domestic utility spike. This umbrella sword is technically a walking aid. This revolver ring is merely decorative, except in emergencies. Judges were not amused, but they were often stuck. Moral panic, the fear that society was becoming too armed. Newspapers published editorials lamenting that every respectable citizen now carried items capable of puncturing, bludgeoning, slicing, or surprising. Critics warned that self-defense gadgets encouraged vigilantism. Women were becoming unmanageably bold. The lower classes might use tools against employers, and widespread arming would make the streets more dangerous. Some moralists even claimed that carrying self-defense devices corrupted character, suggesting that preparedness itself was a sign of moral decline. The irony? These concerns rarely extended to men's weapons. Cane swords barely raised an eyebrow compared to the uproar surrounding a woman armed with a decorative hatpin. Debates over crime versus personal freedom. The Victorian-era debate around self-defense gadgets mirrors modern arguments surprisingly well. Pro-gadget advocates argued the police could not protect everyone. Self-defense was a right and necessity. Women and vulnerable groups especially needed tools to equalize physical disadvantages. Gadgets reduced harm by deterring crime. Anti-gadget reformers countered. Concealed weapons encouraged violence. The line between defense and attack was blurry. Public safety required disarmament, not arming. Women with weapons represented a slipping of social order. Underlying these arguments was a deeper fear, changing gender roles and class dynamics. A working-class woman armed with a hatpin disrupted traditional hierarchies. A middle-class woman carrying a muff pistol disrupted expectations of fragility. A man carrying a hidden club signaled distrust in civic authority. Self-defense tools didn't just protect bodies, they threatened social norms. The compromise, regulate, but don't remove. Eventually society settled into a series of compromises. Hatpin laws required bead-covered tips but permitted long pins. Concealed firearms required licensing. Cane swords remained in a legal grey zone. Bladed jewellery was quietly discouraged but rarely prosecuted. Police encouraged citizens to act responsibly but stopped short of banning gadgets outright. Victorians valued propriety, but they also valued personal freedom, and they deeply valued gadgets. No amount of moral panic could truly erase the Victorian love affair with inventive self-protection. Symbolism, the battle between fear and autonomy. The controversies surrounding self-defense tools reflected larger national anxieties. Fear of urban crime, fear of social change, fear of female empowerment, fear of losing control over the rules of public behaviour. But beneath the panic was something quietly revolutionary. Victorians were beginning to assert personal autonomy, demanding the right to move through the world safely, whether or not society approved of their methods. And so the era marched, spiked, stabbed, and occasionally poked its way into the next century. By now, we've explored a Victorian world stuffed with sword canes, stiletto boots, pepper-filled pouches, Parasol combat schools, revolver rings, weaponized fans, and belts more crowded than a travelling magician's suitcase. And the strangest part, Victorians didn't think any of this was strange, not even a little. In fact, they thought it was sensible, respectable, and downright necessary. The good news, you survive Victorian self-defense. The bad news, your accessories now qualify as weapons grade. To understand how an entire society embraced such a bizarrely creative arsenal, we need to look at the cultural soil that nourished it. Because Victorian self-defense wasn't just about danger, it was about gender, class, industry, anxiety, identity, and the overwhelming yearning of living in a world that was modernizing faster than anyone could fully process. Urbanization. When cities grew, so did fear. Victorians lived through the biggest urban shift in British history. Rural populations flooded cities for work. Streets became crowded, chaotic, and unfamiliar. Crime didn't necessarily skyrocket, but the perception of crime exploded. Fog-choked nights turned strangers into silhouettes. Newspapers turned pickpockets into legendary villains. Gaslit streets cast long shadows that encouraged imaginative fear. People responded to this feeling of uncertainty with tools, clever, strange, sometimes impractical tools, because having something was better than having nothing. Gadgets were a psychological buffer between the individual and the unknown. Self-defense wasn't just protection. It was reassurance in a time when the environment felt unpredictable and overwhelming. Industrialization. The golden age of what if we added a hidden blade. Industrialization brought more than factories and soot. It brought mass production, affordable metalwork, and mechanical experimentation. Inventors churned out gadgets with the enthusiasm of children discovering a new toy box. Why make an umbrella? When you could make an umbrella that becomes a sword, why make a fan when you could add steel ribs sharp enough to ruin someone's evening? If it had a hinge, a handle, or a hollow space, someone, somewhere thought, we could hide a weapon in that. Victorians adored innovation. They celebrated engineers, tinkerers, and inventors. The self-defense gadget boom wasn't an accident. It was the natural intersection of fear and newfound manufacturing capability. Gender roles. When society expected women to be helpless, but also safe. Victorian women lived under suffocating expectations. Be delicate, be polite, be modest, but also fend off unwanted advances, attackers, thieves, and rude men who mistook hats for invitations. Women weren't allowed obvious weapons, so they developed subtextual weaponry, fans that slashed, hatpins that stabbed, parasols that parried, boots that kicked with reinforced vengeance. The brilliance of these devices was that they preserved the appearance of femininity while granting women real, tangible security. Victorian society insisted women remain vulnerable, while offering them no real protection. Women solved the contradiction themselves. Class anxiety, respectability required looking prepared. In Victorian society, respectability was survival. Middle-class men feared looking weak or unprepared, so they bought gentlemen's belts packed with hidden compartments, sword canes, and palm weapons disguised as walking accessories. These items weren't just for protection, they signalled competence, preparedness, and a quiet ability to handle oneself. Meanwhile, working-class citizens favoured inexpensive options like pepper powders or reinforced boots. Creativity flourished across the social ladder. Whether rich or poor, people found ways to feel secure. Your class determined the material. Your fear determined the function. Moral anxiety. The era of everything might kill you, and so be careful. Victorians were famously anxious. Anxious about crime, anxious about morality, anxious about gender inversion, anxious about industrial accidents, anxious about the working poor rising up, anxious about being seen in public without gloves. With so many fears swirling, self-defense tools became coping mechanisms. They allowed people to channel anxiety into preparation. Gadgets were tangible proof that one could do something about the uncertainties of modern life. Even moral critics who wrung their hands over hatpins secretly understood the appeal. Theatrics. Victorians loved flair, even in self-defense. Let's not forget the Victorian taste for drama. This was a society that adored stage melodramas, serialized adventure stories, penny dreadfuls, and elaborate spectacle. Why simply avoid danger when you could? Flick open a fighting fan, pull a blade from your boot, or snap your parasol into combat position with theatrical flourish. Victorian gadgetry wasn't just functional, it was a performance. If possible, it should make the attacker pause and think, did that umbrella just transform? Surprise was a weapon, and Victorians wielded it with pride. Police limitations, when help was not minutes away but streets away. Modern emergency systems didn't exist. Whistles helped, but whistles weren't magic. A policeman might be several blocks away if you were lucky, and fog made sound direction unreliable. Victorians understood a harsh truth. Your safety was primarily your responsibility. That cultural reality fueled the market for self-defense tools. People weren't paranoid, they were pragmatic. The core truth: creativity thrives in fearful times. When people feel uncertain, they innovate. When they feel vulnerable, they adapt. When society cannot fully protect them, they protect themselves through ingenuity. Victorian self-defense gadgets reflect fear fused with invention, etiquette fused with survival instinct, fashion fused with subtle menace. They reveal a culture navigating rapid change, negotiating shifting gender roles, and searching for empowerment within rigid social structures. What seems absurd to us, hatpins as street weapons, fans as knives, muffs hiding revolvers, felt reasonable to Victorians because it emerged from the demands of the era. They didn't see the gadgets as strange. They saw them as solutions that were stylish, dramatic, sometimes ineffective, occasionally ridiculous, but deeply human. Victorian self-defense tools weren't just oddities of the past. They were reflections of a society improvising its way through fear, growth, and transformation. They remind us that history isn't just about inventions, it's about the emotions, insecurities, and cultural pressures that brought those inventions into being. And with that, our journey through Victorian self-defense comes to a close. The good news, you survived it. The bad news, now every time you see a parasol, you'll wonder if it's secretly armed.